You all know this anyway, the amount of Teams and Zoom we've done in recent years. Alex, next slide, please. So please keep your microphones on mute while the speakers are presenting. We've got over 80 registered today, so we are a big group. The event will be recorded. We're going to make this available to yourselves after the webinar, as well as those who couldn't make it, and we might use some of the content on our website as well. If you prefer not to be on the recording, that's absolutely fine. Please keep your microphones and your cameras off throughout, and you can still take part in the session by placing your questions in the Q&A bar. So that's up next to the chat if you've not used that before. And then you feel free to introduce yourself and say hello in the chat function. Next slide. Lovely. So a quick whiz through the agenda. My name's Danny. I work at the University of Exeter as Industrial Impact Fellow on a project called the NICER programme, which I'll explain a little bit more about in a moment. Like I said, we've got a very full agenda today. So we're going to have Professor Fiona Charnley, my colleague, talking to us about what a circular economy is and what might it mean for hospitality, followed by 4 speakers to give us a little bit of the breadth and depth of what a circular economy might look like in different areas of the hospitality business. So hopefully we'll come away with that with a really holistic idea of what the circular economy, what opportunities it offers. So each of our speakers will speak for 15 minutes. We will be taking questions, but not directly after the presentations. So make a note of your questions, put them straight into the Q&A if you like to. We're going to take a break after our speakers, give you a chance to come up with some more questions, and then we'll be straight into a panel discussion after the break. So that panel discussion will include all 5 of our speakers, and we'll work through as many of the questions as we can in that time. If you've got questions that aren't answered, please keep putting them in the Q&A. We'll try and pick them up after the session. They might feed into our webinar content, our working groups and the other activities that we carry out. And we've got something that's asked by lots of people. We'll come back to you following the session. So following the panel discussion, we've just got a couple of practical things to talk about. So we'll be talking about now you know what the circular economy is, how do you measure it, how can you check whether you're moving forward, and then also how you might like to finance your circular economy activities and what's available for you there. Next slide, please. Next one. That's great. So like I said, we're quite a big group today. We asked you when you registered to provide a little bit of information about the organisation that you represented and where you were at with your knowledge of the circular economy. So I thought it'd be nice to share that so you can see a little bit about who's in the room with us. As you can see from the chart on the left, I apologise because I'm sure that some of those boxes were a little bit restrictive for some of you. You might find that you didn't fit in them, but it's really helpful for us to see that we've got a nice spread of organisations from across the hospitality supply chain here in the room with us today, and that's really important for us for our project. In terms of your knowledge of the circular economy, lots of you have come with middling, which is great. We've got a handful of people who are completely new and a few advanced as well. So hopefully there'll be something for everybody in the session today. Next slide. Lovely. So you might be wondering who we are and what we're doing and why. So this is part of the UKRI funded programme, National Interdisciplinary Circular Economy Research Programme. It is a bit of a mouthful, so we refer to it as the NICER programme. And for our non-UK colleagues, the UKRI is the UK Research Institute, and they fund projects across the UK looking to come up with innovative ways of working and make positive change. So we've got, good, just go back a slide a moment, Alex, thank you. So we've got our 5 centres which look at specific resource flows. And this is a really large project. It's the largest investment the UKRI has made to date. So we've got 34 universities collaborating with us on this, over 150 industry partners. And what's really important is that we've got the support of all of the research councils as well. And we've got close links with DEFRA and DESNES all involved in this project. So we've got our 5 centres looking at the specific resource flows, and sitting alongside those is the Circular Economy Hub, which plays a role in coordinating activity, scaling circular economy, and adding value. So when we're looking at scaling the circular economy, we've got a new pot of funding. So the NICER program's been running since January 2020, so we're 3 years in. It's a 4-year programme, and we've had some additional funding this year to run the sectors programme. So it's part of the Circular Economy Hub's activities, and specifically we're looking at, okay, we've got that knowledge now on the material and resource flows. How do we apply that across an entire industrial sector? So we're working with 5 different industrial sectors in the UK to look at what the current activity is in terms of circular economy, what the challenges are, what the gaps are, and specifically what actions can we take and what can we recommend that would help to accelerate the adoption of a circular economy across that sector. So we're working with hospitality or food and accommodation. And so that's yourselves here today. We're also working with the healthcare sector, with defence. We're looking at finance as an enabler, sitting below and supporting all of those sectors. But the really important thing to note, I think, is that as soon as you start looking at a single industrial sector, you realise how each other sector feeds into that. So, of course, many of you aren't specifically from hospitality today, but you do work with the hospitality industry. So we're trying to gather information from you, and I'll talk to you in a bit more detail afterwards about what our next steps are. But you are the experts in your own activities, so we're really looking to work closely with stakeholders on this project to feed into our spotlight report, and we hope to come up with a very high level roadmap for change as well. So I've whizzed through that very, very quickly. We're going to move on now to listen to my colleague, Professor Fiona Charnley, who's co-director of the NICER programme. Over to you, Fiona.
Great, thanks very much, Danny. So hi all, really nice to see you all. As Danny said, I'm Fiona Charnley. I'm a Professor of Circular Innovation in the Business School at the University of Exeter, and alongside the UKRI Circular Economy Hub, I'm co-director of the Exeter Centre for the Circular Economy, which is a large group of academics working across all areas of the circular economy, from manufacturing to services, the built environment, fast-moving consumer goods. But really aiming to support businesses, to support industry move towards a circular economy. So I wanted today to provide you with a bit of an overview of the circular economy. I'm conscious that in the pre-workshop survey, quite a few of you felt that you were already competent in your knowledge around the circular economy, but I find that it's always worth kind of going back to some of the key principles as we're all approaching this from slightly different businesses and sort of disciplinary backgrounds. So I wanted to start by kind of setting the scene and exploring how the circular economy framework can contribute to tackling global challenges such as climate change, biodiversity loss, waste and pollution, and how it fits into the often quite confusing narrative around net zero, zero waste, 2030 climate targets, which, as I said, can be quite confusing. So as we all know, the current linear model of production and consumption is highly wasteful, and this is evidenced across all of our different sectors. For example, 350,000 tonnes of clothing or 7 million tonnes of uneaten food that go to landfill each year, and that's just in the UK alone. However, our current linear economy is not only highly wasteful, but a major contributor to climate change, as we can see by the 18.4 million tonnes of CO2 emissions produced each year just by the chemicals sector in the UK alone. And climate change is as much an economic and social crisis as it is an environmental crisis, with the costs of climate change to the global economy being felt all around us, and its impacts on society, and particularly the most vulnerable, we can see are already devastating. And what we've found that actually current climate change policies have tended to focus on the adoption of renewable energy and energy efficiency. And whilst this is important, it only actually tackles part of the picture. As if the uptake of these policies was optimal, it would actually only offset 55% of greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, as the other 45% of these emissions come from the way that we make and use products and food that surround us. And this is where the circular economy can contribute by alternative models of production and consumption. And this is particularly important as we look at the hospitality sector. So if we go on to the next slide, please. As we can see in this table, which I've borrowed from the excellent net zero guide for the brewing and hospitality sector, which has been produced by the Zero Carbon Forum, on average, over 80% of CO2 emissions from the sector as a whole are attributed to Scope 3 emissions, and a significant portion of these are attributed to elements such as the goods that we purchase, the services that we purchase across the sector, the use of capital goods and the use of products, and also the logistics that make the sector work. And these are all areas in which the adoption and implementation of circular economy strategies and solutions can make a real difference. So moving on to the next slide, I also wanted to point out that the current linear economy presents us not only with a climate challenge, but also a significant materials challenge. And I wanted to take technology metals as an example. So technology metals are an essential subset of specialist and often referred to as critical metals, and they're fundamental enablers throughout all industry, particularly in clean energy and digital technologies. Digital technologies obviously increasingly being used across the hospitality sector. And so these metals are crucial to delivering the UK's ambition for net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And we're seeing that the demand for many of these tech metals is increasing rapidly. So not only do we need to use more of these metals than ever before to decarbonise, but we also need a wider range of these metals. And to take an example, if we wanted to replace all UK-based diesel and petrol vehicles today with electric vehicles, it would take just under twice the total annual world cobalt production and 75 of the world's lithium production. Which are, significant figures. And despite these figures, the amounts of these materials mined per year will still be orders of magnitude less than other major industry metals, such as aluminium, iron, and copper. And at the moment, the UK currently remains close to 100% import reliant for these metals, and most of those metals arrive in components or products. So we are highly reliant across all sectors on our global value chain and the import of materials. And therefore, the circular economy provides us with a really important framework to retain the use of these different materials, critical metals, but other materials that we're reliant on, so that we can recapture that value and build up our resilience in the UK. So if we move on to the next slide, I wanted to highlight what the circular economy framework looks like. I'm sure many of you are already familiar with this diagram, and this framework is one of several that explains what a circular economy is, but I find this one to be particularly useful from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And so the circular economy is a systems framework that aims to address these different material and climate related challenges, excuse me, by decoupling production and consumption from our reliance on finite resources, largely through innovation and entrepreneurship. Oh, sorry. And so, as you can see in this diagram, we have the current linear economy running through the centre of the diagram, all the way through from mining our materials and minerals, to production, to distribution, where they're distributed to users for often a very short amount of time, and then typically end up at the end of life in landfill or being captured for incineration and energy. So the circular economy then provides us with opportunities on the right and left-hand side of this diagram, which has been split into biological nutrients on the left-hand side and technological materials on the right-hand side. The important differentiation between these is that obviously biological nutrients can decompose and regenerate our natural ecosystems, and so we should be encouraging those materials and nutrients to do so, such as food. And then on the right hand side, the technological materials obviously can't decompose back into our natural ecosystem, so we should be trying to circulate and retain the value from those materials as much as possible. And on the right hand side, as you can see, you have lots of different strategies for how we do that, how we retain that value. And the circular economy encourages us to go around the inner circles as many times as possible. So reuse, repair, maintenance, before moving towards the outer cycles, such as remanufacture and recycling, because as we move towards these activities, we have to use more resources and they're more energy intensive activities. So trying to remain in the inner circles. And often there's a misconception around the circular economy that it is all about waste and it's all about recycling, whereas actually, as you can see, recycling, although it plays a critical role, is the least favourable option. So just to summarise, the key principles of a circular economy are to design out waste and pollution at the outset, to keep products and materials at their highest value for as long as possible, and to regenerate our natural systems and power this system through renewable energy. And just moving on to the next slide, as I mentioned, it's quite common when considering circularity to look at the downstream impacts or the repercussions of our linear economy, i.e. waste and waste avoidance and material recovery. However, the circular economy is a systems approach, and it's just important to think about the upstream actions that can be taken, such as refusing or reducing the amount of materials that we're using in the first place before we think about how we can extend product life cycles through things like reuse, repair and refurbish, and then how we can make the maximum value of our materials through recycling and recovery. So moving on to the next slide, in a circular economy, value is super important, and value is not just delivered in one direction between producers and consumers as it is in a linear economy, but it's actually exchanged between systems partners to create closed loop systems through practices such as cascades and reuse and remanufacturing. And this really requires brand new relationships to be formed by all sorts of different stakeholders in the system. So we're really seeing new types of relationships form between manufacturers, their suppliers, and the end users, so that we can maximise this value from the systems approach that we're taking. And quite often, we've seen that one way businesses are exploring the opportunity for new value creation is through the development of new or alternative business models. And as shown on the next slide, these circular business models can broadly be categorised into 5 categories. So first of all, we have circular inputs. So this is where businesses are optimizing the design of their materials or products using renewable energy or bio-based materials or recycled input to replace their single life cycle inputs. We have resource recovery. So this is where businesses are recovering useful resources and energy out of disposed products or byproducts from their manufacturing processes. We have product life extension. So this is where businesses are extending the working life cycle of products and components through different circular economy strategies, such as repair, upgrading, reselling, remanufacture. We then have product as a service. So this is where businesses are offering access to the products that they're manufacturing as opposed to ownership. And this is therefore internalising the benefits of a circular system, because the manufacturer retains ownership of all of their materials and products and can reuse them again and again. And then finally, we have this category that we refer to as enabling solutions. So this is where we're seeing organisations that may not be manufacturing anything, but they are developing new technologies, they're looking at new ways of using data to enable the circulation of materials and resources by other stakeholders within the system. And I'm just going to go on to provide you with a couple of examples of some of these. However, I'm conscious that some of our other speakers today will go into more detail about particular elements of these. So if we take circular design as an example, we're seeing a lot of innovation in the biomaterial space. And one of these that you might be familiar with because they've gained a lot of attention recently is Nopla. So Nopla have developed a material that is based on plants and seaweed. It's biodegradable in 4 to 6 weeks, just like a piece of fruit. It's edible, so it can be flavoured or coloured. You can consume the whole thing. And importantly, it requires a lot less energy to manufacture and produces a lot less CO2 than PET, for example, and it's also cheaper than the plastic alternative. So this is the company that are really looking at that upstream part of a circular economy to try and develop new materials that are going to replace our reliance on single-use plastics in this case. And I think Nopla are a really interesting company to look at because they've developed a material that has lots of different applications across food, for example, their relationship with Just Eat to replace kind of those single-use ketchup and mayonnaise sachets, but also lots of other application areas such as events, in hospitality where they're looking to replace single-use water bottles. Biome are another really interesting organisation. Oh, sorry, sticking on that slide. They're innovating again in the space of bio-based materials to replace single-use materials. Their material is predominantly mycelium-based, and they've developed a range of products and services across the consumer goods and packaging industry, but also in the built environment. So they're producing mycelium-based internal walls and insulations for buildings or for refits. Which is, again, another interesting example to look at. So moving on to the next example, I wanted to give you an example of a product as a service. So as we all know, particularly working in the hospitality and accommodation sector, modern appliances often break down quickly, and we've seen that they're being thrown away as a result of this. And this is particularly prevalent in hotels or self-catering accommodation with a quick turnaround of guests, where the pressure of having working appliances such as fridges and washing machines is even higher than normal. And so this company that are based in the Netherlands, Homey, offer a pay-per-use service through which a customer can lease an appliance and pay a monthly fee for the use of that appliance, or they even have an option where you can pay per use. So if you have a washing machine, you can pay per wash. And the company offers a free repair. They offer a free moving service of the appliance, and then obviously they collect that appliance at the end of life for either remanufacturing or recycling. And we're really seeing a move towards product as a service or access over ownership models by many different manufacturers, where the OEM retains ownership of the product and, as I said, internalises the benefits. So they're building up their resilience and making themselves much more also much less reliant on kind of the purchase of new products or relying on that global supply chain for those materials coming in. And then just the final example that I wanted to share, oh, that one, yep, is a company called Winnow Solutions, which some of you who are in this industry may have already heard of. So as we all know, food waste costs the hospitality industry a significant amount. It's been estimated to be 100 billion annually, and kitchens can waste up to 20% of the food that they purchase, and often that's equivalent to their total net profits. So Winnow have developed a technology that helps chefs and kitchens to achieve a greater visibility in their kitchens of the food that they're using and the food that they're throwing away, so that they can make better decisions that lead to a dramatic decrease in food waste and the costs associated with that. So they've worked with a number of quite significant partners now, IKEA and Costa Cruises, to really demonstrate how the technology can work. And this is a technology that's AI enabled, so it tracks exactly what the kitchen is disposing of and provides the data to help kitchens make those decisions to prevent future waste. And beyond this example, we're seeing a significant increase in the use of digital technology and data to enable the adoption of circular business models, and to increase the transparency across the value chain. So just on that previous slide still, sorry, Alex, we recently published a report called Digital World 2050, which brings together a number of examples and recommendations of how digital technology can support a move towards net zero manufacturing by 2050. So I've provided the link in that slide for those who are interested. So then just moving on to the final slide, and just another click for some questions. I just wanted to add that obviously the hospitality sector is a complex sector made up of many different kind of subsectors within that kind of umbrella of hospitality. And within that, there are lots of different resource flows and materials. So when we're looking at a circular economy, it's more important than ever to take this whole system approach. And a number of the business models that I've shared with you, one size doesn't fit all. So I think when we're looking at a sector such as this, we need to think about how we can adopt different circular strategies for the circulation of different materials, different businesses, depending on kind of what the focus is. And it's also really important to develop those new relationships with our suppliers and across the value chain to ask kind of some of these key questions about how do we redesign things to last longer? How do we design for both physical and emotional durability? How do we embed some of these circular strategies such as reuse, repair, upgrade, disassembly? Also need to think about things such as standardization of products and materials and how those reverse logistics are going to work if we're going to retain the ownership of our products and materials. And then finally, but definitely not least, is the skills and capabilities that we need to build in our workforces for the future to enable us to design these types of systems and implement them. So thank you very much. Just hopefully that's given you a bit of an overview of circularity and how it can apply to hospitality. But as I said, the speakers that are up next have much more specific expertise with regard to some of these different subsectors.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Fiona. Lovely to have some really practical examples of businesses that are doing things differently in the hospitality sector. The examples that we've looked at so far have been quite zoomed in. We're looking at food and packaging and white goods. For our next talk, we're going to really zoom out and think about construction and refurbishment and the way that it affects many hospitality businesses. So it's my pleasure to welcome Catherine Adams, Director of Reusefully, to talk to us.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all fine.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we obviously all live in buildings, work in buildings. Hospitality is usually undertaken in a building. So I just wanted to sort of give a bit of a perspective on some of the drivers for circularity in construction, refurbishment, provide you with a few examples. So just to sort of get a feel, I guess, of what's going on. There's always more that could happen, always is for circularity. So I own a company called Reusefully. I have about, oh goodness, over 20 years experience now in construction, a lot of that on resource efficiency, construction, demolition waste, circularity. Next slide. And that's us, although there's a few more of us now, so I need to update the slide. We work across the supply chain, so very much from client through to manufacturer, designer, contractor, demolition at end of life, and we have quite a nice range of projects. So we get involved in quite a lot of policy work at European and UK level, but then we also get our hands dirty and go around buildings doing pre-demolition audits and looking at what can be reclaimed and reused. So it's quite a nice balance of and keeping it very real sometimes. Next slide. So just the big picture really. The construction industry is not good in terms of the resources it uses, a massive resources. That slide figures I haven't got today, but as well as that, it just generates a load of waste. It's done it for years, doesn't seem to be getting any better in terms of the amount that's being generated. So we you know, it's a bad tick in our box for that. Not much gets landfilled these days, apart from soil. There's quite a big issue with soils, but I don't think that's of interest too much here. Not much gets landfilled, as I said, but saying that, much of the materials gets downcycled. And as Fiona said, we just don't maintain the value in a lot of our materials. So, you know, most of our brick and concrete will be crushed up for fill activities. Timber will go to biomass or chipped up for panel board. So we're not very good at retaining that value. So that's what we're really trying to move towards as a sector, really, in terms of being a bit better. And the graph on the right just shows you that waste generation overall isn't really reducing that much. It can be quite hard to tell from the statistics as well. They're not great because they don't really split out construction and demolition waste. And obviously there's very different activities affecting them. And then within that, you've got all the fit out waste, which is probably where the hospitality sector fits in more and all that sort of interior design aspects. Next slide. And what we're seeing now is really this sort of approach. We call it building as material banks. So it's really sort of looking at this donor recipient model, if you like. So looking at what we already have in our building stock and how we can then utilize those materials and products into a current building. So that's the donor recipient model. And then with a current building, and when we're designing that, it's very much looking at how we design that to enable that to be a donor building in the future. So that's looking at making sure we design for adaptability, flexibility, and making sure that those sort of products and materials can be reused. So that's quite a lot of thinking when it comes to the built environment. Next slide. The carbon is king when it comes to the built environment. So we really, this is a different topic for a different day, whether how circularity and carbon relate together, but very much, you know, we see circularity as a way of driving down embodied carbon. And embodied carbon, how we express that in construction anyway, is the amount of energy, so carbon that's been expended in the materials that we use, to put that very, very simply. But ways that you can reduce that embodied carbon are through, obviously, using less materials, but using reused materials, using materials that have a higher recycled content, and then also using bio-based materials as well. And you're seeing clients setting quite a few targets now in terms of reaching targets for embodied carbon. So it's quite a driver to then look at those different materials within that sort of sphere, if you like. Next slide. And we are, some of the bigger developers have got quite a bit of guidance now, strategies, requirements when it comes to circularity. I put a couple of examples here where it actually relates to sort of fit out materials. So looking at requiring reclaimed, remanufactured materials, looking at leasing in furniture, for example, also bringing in the health impacts, which relates back to bio-based materials and having a healthy indoor environment and low VOC products such as your paints. The one on the left is a table from British Land, and that just shows you some of the targets that they're setting in terms of trying to drive, you know, drive resources, more resource efficiency, trying to drive recycling over downcycling, but then also as well sort of specifying the data needs, making sure that there's material passports. So that's something we're hearing about quite a lot now in the construction industry as well. So making sure that we know what's in our building, because at the end of the day, if we know what information we have for our materials and products, it very much helps for them to be reused at the end of their life, especially if we've got their certification and warranties, and because that's one of the biggest barriers. Next slide. This is quite a driver in London, and quite a few of the boroughs are now picking up on this as well, in terms of if you have a large development, a referable development, it goes to the GLA, Greater London Authority, where a circular economy statement has to be provided. And as part of this circular economy statement, we have to do all those things listed. So we have to do a pre-demolition audit. I'll talk about them very quickly in a minute. You have to look at end-of-life scenarios for different products. You have to look at making sure that the project overall has got recycled content, 20% by value, looking at recycled content, and an end of life plan for the building as well. So what's going to happen to that at the end of life? Is it designed to be disassembled and deconstructed? Next slide. I get a lot involved in lots of these. So these are pre-demolition and refurbishment audits, very applicable for refurbishment as well. So just interior, where you go in, you assess what's in that building, and you really try and assess what can be reused over and above recycling. It's not easy because often the new scheme doesn't want, it's got a very different sort of design philosophy from the old scheme. So difficult to reuse stuff potentially like that. But there's also, you know, these jobs are done very fast as well. So the logistics, getting things out undamaged, if it's going to take more time, can also be an issue. But the sooner you do these sorts of things, the more it can feed into the design or trying to sell or give away materials to other people. Next slide. And this is from Arup. I won't dwell on this too much because I think Fiona covered quite a lot of this, but quite an interesting way of thinking out our buildings is this diagram on the left, which is called the shearing layers. So you can see it as site, structure, skin, services, space plan stuff, and souls. Souls is a new one. I haven't heard of that. So that's us people. But the nice way of looking at it is because all those different layers last a different amount of time. And for that purposes, we want to sort of look at different principles that relate to those amount of time. So for your stuff, for example, your furniture and equipment, you're looking very much, you know, that's very short-lived. You don't really want to own that. You want to try and lease that in, for example. Space plan, that's looking at very much in terms of its flexibility in that plan, and also can it be sort of, you know, disassembled for further reuse under those 3 years. So it's just taking those sort of different design principles and overlaying it with sort of how the building works. Next slide. There is lots of opportunities when it comes to circularity as well, as you would expect. This is for a retail project. I was trying to find a nice diagram for a hotel or restaurant, but I failed miserably. But this just gives you some thinking really about you know, what we use material wise, how it's sort of connected together, because that's really important when it comes to construction. You may have a really sort of good circular product, but it usually ends up in a system, in a building. And if it's joined together in a way that you can't get that product out easily, you know, it breaks on removal, then the circularity of that product in terms of reuse is really, really limited. So this example, for instance, do you really need false ceilings? You know, or if you do need boarding up there for acoustic properties, that sort of thing, can you have sort of co-functional type systems there? Wall cladding as well, you know, do you need it? If you do, there's lots of different sort of bio-based materials that can be used now. Plasterboard is just a nightmare when it comes to sort of recycling and reuse and stud walls and that sort of thing. And internal partitions, can you use furniture? Can you use different sort of textiles for that rather than sort of big glass type things? And flooring as well, you know, flooring, obviously it needs to be durable, but I see so much flooring that's so hard to sort of disassemble at end of life. It's all glued together if it's timber. So it's just thinking about those different opportunities really in terms of sort of the different elements of the building. Next slide. This is a really nice case study. You can have a look at it in the design. Design's really nice. It's got sort of from the design world, it's got some really nice sort of visual examples, if you like. And I think this one won an award actually. So it's a restaurant. They removed a timber staircase. They required the contractor to remove this staircase quite carefully. And then you can see on the right-hand side, they used some of the treads from that staircase into a nice sort of feature wall cladding. So that's very much sort of building as material banks. In this case, they used the staircase as a material bank. They also used, for example, the old skirting boards and architraves. That they removed them, and I think they used them for some of the interiors as well. And with the walls as well, they just removed the plasterboard and left them like that, because I quite like it anyway. It's probably not for everyone. And then with the stuff, with the reclaimed, chairs and tables reclaimed and second-hand. Next slide. I found this actually, which may be of use to people. It's not, unfortunately, in the UK yet, but it's a whole list of sort of different products for hotels, looking at both sort of the furnishing, furniture and textiles, and looking at it in terms of the different design principles. So whether they're bio-based, whether they last a long time, whether they have a higher recycled content, or whether they're just really good in their production because they use less hazardous materials. So maybe worth looking at that as well. Next slide. I could talk all day really about circularity and all the different materials and everything, but I haven't got time. Glass, I don't know if glass comes up a lot in hospitality. Glass is a real issue when during sort of demolition, I guess, because it can be really hard to handle for reuse. Lots of it will just get downcycled and just put into the aggregate, which is a real waste of energy. If you put glass back into glass manufacture, there's a real sort of carbon saving there. But it's also sort of just looking at being innovative in the way that, we design our buildings there. And you can see, for example, the whole load of old window timber frames, and I think they're from old train windows as well. So I think that's a really good thing with circularity. It allows us to we should use it as a tool to be, think quite differently in terms of how we design our buildings and spaces. Next slide. Oh, there's another one. Just a couple of projects that we're working on. This is quite an interesting one. This is Innovate UK funded actually. Looking at, can you use AI to go around a building, automatically identify what's in it, link it back to the manufacturer potentially, make my life a lot easier with pre-demolition audits. And therefore you've got that whole sort of information, and information is really, really critical, because if we know that, we know the manufacturer, we know if it's warranted or not, it's much easier to be able to sort of reuse these materials. Next slide. This is a really good place to start. I am biased because I was one of the authors, but if you are interested in construction, it's called Zero Avoidable Waste, but it really is all about circularity. So if you are interested in delving down a bit more in terms of sort of construction circularity, this gives you quite a lot of sort of the issues, what's happened before, what needs to happen across a whole sort of life cycle stage of a building, including the area of refurbishment. And refurbishment waste is quite, there is an issue there, because there is a lot of it. It can be difficult to deal with, and it's just the timescales of it. Next slide. And I also have another hat as the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products, which is running a Reuse Now campaign focusing on construction products. But go and have a look at that. because there's an event and we're running a survey. So be great if anyone wanted to participate in that. And that next slide, I think that's it. Yes, it is. Hopefully I've kept to time. Apologies if I haven't. Thank you.
You're absolutely fine. Thank you so much, Catherine. There's so many useful resources there that people will be able to look up. Thank you. So moving on from construction in theory, we've got the Pier House project by St Austell. I'm really pleased to invite Elle and Carolyn to come and talk about the beginning of their circular economy journey and what that looks like for their project. So welcome, Elle and Caroline.
Hey guys. Good morning, everyone. Yes, my name's Elle. I'm Head of Sustainability for St Austell Brewery.
And I am Caroline. I am the Interior Design Manager.
Yeah, very much early stages of this project. So as part of what we do at the brewery, so we brew beer, but we also have a lot of pubs. And part of the life cycle of that is that we do refurbishments periodically. We know that they embody a lot of carbon. There's a lot of waste that comes into it. We have to build with keeping up with the design of the times and the sort of functionality of those buildings. So one of the biggest challenges for us is how to do that in a sensitive way. So this is the first project for us where we've started to embed some of those circular principles. Very much a live project. I should caveat the decisions that we're talking about today and the lessons are very live. We're literally sort of on site at the moment and we'll be delivering it in June.
Next slide, please, Alex. Thank you.
Okay, so St Austell Brewery, we are based down in the southwest. We have two breweries, one in Bristol and one in St Austell in Cornwall. We've got 43 of our own pubs, as well as 135-ish leased pubs, so the companies run their own businesses out of our buildings, with a spread mostly across the southwest, and we're sort of into South Wales a little bit as well now. But you may know us from our bigger brands, which is our delicious beers, which you can see.
Next slide. So I'll sort of give you a bit of an overview of what the Pier House is. So it's a Grade 2 listed, probably one of our flagship sites in Cornwall, building in a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Charlestown, which is a working harbour. Beautiful. It is, you know, absolutely key to the community of St Austell in the area. High footfall, loads of traffic, loads of tourists, but you know, an amazing, it's always one of the places that everyone wants to go and see. So the building itself is vast. It's had lots of additions over the years, but the front two elevations are the listed parts and there's some later additions on the back. And we had a pretty colossal fire last January, which if you click over to the next slide, Alex, there's a few pictures on here that just kind of illustrates quite how bad it was. Came out of nowhere, 5 p.m. on I think it was a Friday night. We believe it to be a small electrical fire that ended up kind of ravaging the whole back elevation of the pub. Luckily, that was the newer additions, kind of 80s, 90s additions. It ended up affecting about half of the roof in its entirety. And about a third of the building. So it was, you know, we were full of customers. It was lucky that everyone got out safely and everything was fine. And all we had to do is figure out how we save the building. So if you click onto the next slide, we were due to do a project at some point, but this kind of expedited how quickly we did it because we knew that we had to kind of maintain the building, also because it's such a key part of the community. From everyone that lives in the area that comes and works at the brewery, it's so integral to everyone's lives that we needed to do something with it, and we needed to, one, open it as soon as we could, and two, make sure that we were saving it, and that required quite a lot of thought and I think discussions internally about how we approach the project with a more circular mentality, which is something that we haven't really done before to the extent that we could have done. So it was a bit of a learning curve, I think, wasn't it, for how we do that. And we are in it now. We are working up the designs, having all of those conversations, thrashing it out, trying to find the best solution for stuff. So we are very much open to how we approach it and how we approach other projects in the future.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is that yeah, this is the first iteration, and this isn't just kind of a one-hit wonder. We'll be implementing this in more detail and working up to our net zero goal of 2040, using a lot of our learnings as we go through our refurbishments over the next decades. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is the guiding sort of mantra for lots of things in life, but particularly when it comes to this. I think when we first started the discussion with Danny and the team at the University of Exeter, there were so many possibilities. You know, do we focus on construction? Do we focus on furniture and fittings? We talked a lot about community as well. You know, although this is quite a seasonal pub, it's very high revenue. We get a lot of tourists in the summer.
Yeah.
It's also the heart of the community in Charlestown. And so when we're talking about community regeneration and how that underpins a lot of our kind of circular principles in this, there's a lot to go at. So we just need to make a start and prioritise how we're going to do it. Next slide. Right, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the methodology of how we approached it. So the first thing we did is a materials audit. This is just an extract of the construction part, but we did this for every part of the building. So we did constructions, appliances, bathroom furniture, fittings and fixtures, etc. Went through absolutely everything that would be involved in the construction and refurbishment of that. Looked at what would be business as usual, the materials, the lifespan of those, not just the lifespan as in when is it going to break, but also when it comes to things like tiles, you know, when are they out of date, when are they out of fashion, when would we throw them away? Which is sort of the key metric here.
And I guess maybe probably the interesting thing is we were coming at this pretty blind and actually looking at what we do currently to what the potential was and what improvements we could be making. I think we ended up realizing that we were doing a lot more than we maybe thought we were, and we were reusing and redistributing things within our estate that we hadn't really realised was part of that kind of circular mentality, which I think was really great and really positive to keep everyone motivated in that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely agree. You can see here on the end of life solution that a lot of what we were doing as sort of business as usual was around that recycle piece, which we want to do better at. Although it's not the very worst solution, it's definitely not the very best. So how do we improve on that? Okay, next slide, please. So as I said, I mean, this was potentially a really big project, multi-million-pound budget to get this done. We had a lot to go out with. Some of our biggest time constraints were making sure that we have it open in time for the summer next year so we can deliver on the commercial aspects. But we really wanted to focus on a few elements. So that was rethink how we're using and how we approach the building, looking at how we implement repair contracts, for example, reusing. And as Caroline says, we're already doing a lot of that anyway through some of the conservation work. And it's a grade 2 listed building, and refurbish a lot of the furniture and fittings as much as possible as well. Being a pretty rural community, the local networks is absolutely key here, and we're already working with businesses in the local area to either refurbish or repurpose or look after our waste in a more carbon-minded way.
And there's definitely an appetite for that. I think within being the brewery, you know, we are in the spotlight. Lots of people work either directly for us at head office. It's so integral to the community of Cornwall. Everyone knows our pubs, whether it's the ones that we run and manage ourselves or whether it's our tenanted estate. We are really visible in the Southwest. We're really visible to everyone, whether it's tourists or whether it's the local community. So I think there's a lot in making sure that we are giving back to the community and we are kind of redistributing and considering them as part of our journey and how we can be using the community better to help us and also help the community in turn. So this is a bit of, I mean, again, reiterating the point that we are early on in our journey and we are constantly learning about better ways of working. So this is a bit of a snapshot of things that we're trying to look at. And, you know, some of this is about having those internal discussions about the best course of action for us, or given our timeframes, you know, we're trying to open this site in approximately June, and we've obviously got a lot of work to do to get the building safe before we do anything. We have to put a new roof back on. The nature of the beast is that it is a grade 2 listed building, so we are somewhat restricted on certain things that we can do. We're working really closely with our conservation officer, and we have heritage specialist architects working with us who are working with the conservation officer to make sure that we're doing the right thing for the building, but also making sure that things are commercially viable. So things like we've managed to source 300 square meters of reclaimed Delabole slate to go back on the roof. So we're salvaging a lot of what's on there that's on there at the moment that hasn't been contaminated and that we can reuse, and then we're supplementing it with reclaim. So it's easy things like that we can do, but then that kind of goes a bit further into things like how we're refitting our kitchen and how we are predominantly being as reliant on electricity as we can. We are somewhat, again, restricted by loadings and the incoming supply because of the nature of being in a slightly more rural community. We're on the end of the country, so there isn't as much available to us. So we are about, I think, in the kitchen it is, I'd say, about 98% electric. We've had to make a few allowances. We redistribute a lot of our kitchen equipment, again, to within our either managed estate or tenanted if needed. And we often reuse a lot of the equipment that we have because we have a spec, so we know that we always want a certain type of fryer or salamander or any of those things that we know that we're always going to use the same thing. So it's kind of maintaining that lifespan, whether it's there or whether it's in a different site. We've tried to work pretty hard on the utilities and just kind of reduce our energy consumption and make things as efficient as possible. And we've onboarded some M&E specialists to have a look at what we're doing and see how we can do it better. And then things like the materials, again, it's just kind of deep diving into ways that we can do things better. And, you know, using alternative materials, so looking at biomaterials and things that we can do, like insulation is one that I think is a pretty easy win for us. So it's just understanding a bit more about what we can do that's going to make a difference.
I just want to talk about plaster as well. I just happened, this is the stuff I love about working in the local community, is that I just happened to see a Facebook post which said we need plasterboard in good condition. Does any businesses have any? And we were like, actually, we've got loads. So we're able to kind of close that loop a little bit more with the local community and say, you know, redistribute. It just happened to be serendipitous that they needed plasterboard and we had a load. So it's things like that, which needs more time and needs more thought, and potentially you need a bit more money and resources to deliver it now. But once we can embed those processes, I feel quite optimistic about what's possible. I'm just going to talk a little bit about food as well. So this is not specific to the Pier House project, but as a hospitality business, we do have a large amount of food waste as part of our estate. Some of it's plate scrapes, but actually a largest portion of that is ingredients that we just don't use in time, or excess food at the end of the day that would typically go in the bin. So on Monday, we are launching the partnership with Olio, which is the edible food redistribution scheme. We're the first pub company to do this. We're launching it across 20 of our sites on Monday, and then we'll roll the rest out in the next coming months. But during the pilot that we did on this over the summer, we shared over 300 meals with the local community, all stuff that would have headed for the bin. So we're making sure that we are building these processes in sort of when we're designing them up front. We already measure and compost all our food waste. We are technically zero waste to landfill. A lot of that does go to incineration, but about 60% does get recycled across all of our waste, food waste being one of it. So we're just taking that a step further for redistribution. Okay, next slide.
Yeah, I mean, this is really about how we're kind of tackling that shift in mindset. I think some of the lessons that we've learned are that there is, especially when we are coming at something with pace, and we're coming at a project with pace, that we often find, or have found in conversations we've had, a bit of pushback on, oh, well, you know, we're not sure about that, we're not sure about that. There's always an easier way to go. There's always an easier material to use. So it's trying to make sure that with those relationships we have with contractors and suppliers, that we are leaning on them and expressing how important it is for us, and as part of our values, that we are implementing these things. So it's not it's a non-negotiable for some things, and it's kind of changing their mindset and not just thinking that we can, you know, negotiate our way around it. Actually, it's from the get-go part of that project brief, and it forms a really important part of it. So if we all want to work together, we need to make sure that we're factoring all of that in. And I think there's a bit on skills, and again, mindset shift, I think, internally, of us having these conversations, and it's been brilliant, and everyone's felt really inspired, I think, by talking about things and not just doing things the same way and not following the status quo.
And then prioritize. This has to be the number one. I think, as I said, like, we don't have everything squared away with this project, but we have been able to rethink how we're looking at this project, and this is absolutely forming the blueprint of what we're going to do next, and we're going to do it better next time. And so prioritize what's possible. And so Caroline has prioritized sort of some natural materials, rethinking the space, like redistributing around the kitchen, salvaging some of the construction materials as well. So yeah, I mean, there's loads of stuff we've talked about. Danny and the team have been amazing at providing examples of what's possible. So we just need to incrementally build on that.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it is a learning curve, and it's a bit of a catalyst for all the things that we could do that are possible. So, you know, we're on a growth agenda as a business. We're acquiring new sites. We're also looking to invest in our existing sites. So we have multiple large capex investments.
Move on to the next slide.
Over the next however many years. And that's, you know, 3 to 5 year plan of investing in, again, a lot of these are historic buildings. A lot of them are Grade 2 listed. A lot of them have got really have loads of historical importance. So it's about how we apply those principles to these buildings, and how we work within those parameters of having to, you know, keep conservation officers happy and make sure we're doing the right thing for the building and the right thing for the community. So it is definitely a massive learning curve. But our plan is to do 2 of these kind of major projects a year, and then we do about 4 or 5 smaller investments to kind of upkeep our existing managed estate. So it's kind of how we can apply some of those principles to those as well, I think will be interesting, and it not be quite so disposable and, you know, quick turnaround. That actually there's a lot that we can do that maybe we wouldn't have got to unless we were doing a massive project.
And next slide. Yeah, so last slide is just to focus on, I mean, as Caroline says, we've got another 2 of these really big multi-million-pound investments next year. So we want to get to a point where we're doing less refurbishments, do more around circularity of utilities, more around food and menus, and sort of really build on the themes that we've got so far. Very, very early stages of thinking about a fully circular bar in Cornwall as well, which is very exciting. That's all from us. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Caroline and Elle, for a really honest and open description of your circular journey and how it's been going. I think it's really inspiring to hear from someone who's just starting out with it. And I hope that some of you, perhaps new to the circular economy, will be encouraged to have a look at what you can do in your own businesses. So although we put hospitality in the title, what we're really looking at for this industry sector is food and accommodation. So the next couple of talks will be focused more on those 2 elements. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Louise Payton from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation to talk to us about food and menu redesign. Thank you, Louise.
Hi there, everyone. Nice to see you all. So I'm Louise. I work in the food team at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. And today I'm going to be focusing specifically on menu redesign, though, as has been mentioned so far, there's lots of different elements around food. So this is just kind of one way of looking at it that I think is really exciting. If you go to the next slide, please. So for those of you who don't know, I'll skip a slide there. But the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, our mission is to accelerate the shift to a circular economy. So we have a wide network, and food is just one of the many things that we work on. Next slide, please. So yeah, I wanted to start by asking some questions. So it's kind of a bit of a mindset change in a way, which thinking about food. So it's thinking about things like, what if your food could build biodiversity? And could the solution to climate change be delicious? So these kind of questions, I think, can be a really inspiring way to kind of take that mind shift change in terms of how a circular economy can be applied. Thank you. So yeah, first of all, just a really quick overview of what we currently have in the food system, which is that linear economy that's already been talked about, and very much a take, make, waste approach. Food waste is the first thing that will come to mind when you kind of use that framing. And it is a massive problem. So about a third of edible food is wasted. And if this was a country, it would be the third largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. So it's a pretty big problem. But it's not just about the direct waste. We've got problems across the food system in terms of inefficiency. For example, unhealthy food is the world's biggest cause of death. And obviously food is unhealthy for our planet as well. I've been working on problems in the food system for a long time, and it can be quite hard to summarise all the different problems. So I've just picked a quote from an article in 2020 involving 3 scientists, but including one called Johan Rockström. And it says, "Food is failing us. The global food system is the single largest greenhouse gas emitting sector in the world. It's by far the largest cause of biodiversity loss, terrestrial ecosystem destruction, freshwater consumption, waterway pollution, and it holds a firm grip over the stability of the Earth system and the future of humanity." So that all sounds quite doom and gloom, but I thought I'd kind of focus on the bright side, which is that if you change the food system, then you can really have a huge positive impact, like across society and the planet. So, for example, I wanted to be a wildlife conservationist, so that's why I work on food. But if you want to save lives in terms of human health, climate change, then working on food is an amazing place to have huge impact. I think that's really exciting. So instead of looking at all the bad side, it's like looking at the potential for change. And one of my favourite examples for just how there's such a potential to change how things are, and that is how unimaginative our food is at the moment, and how therefore there's lots of opportunity to be innovative. So in particular, when I go to a supermarket or a restaurant, I often used to think that there was a huge diversity of food to choose from. But through my career and learning more about farm systems, I started to realise that a lot of the foods boiled down to a few crops. And in actual fact, across the world, just 4 crop species take up about 60% of global calories. And even if you're buying, for example, chicken, that can be fed the same plants, so like corn and maize, for example, and wheat. So there's huge potential to be innovative, to use lots of different ingredients and to change things. Next slide, please. So this is a lovely graphic from our report from a few years ago. And on what should be your left-hand side, it shows kind of what currently our countryside in the UK looks like in large area, and well, mostly to the east. And this is where we're basically bending nature to produce food. So our landscapes are being shaped by the kind of food that we are buying, we're sourcing, we're using. But over to the right-hand side, or what should be your left, is the diverse, thriving landscape of what looks like if you start to think about how the choice of ingredients and where you're sourcing it from, which is kind of a way of designing your food to create those kind of thriving landscapes for wildlife and for soils. Next slide, please. So the report I mentioned, we came up with this framework here, which we call the circular design for food. And it's a really helpful framework, I think, in terms of how you can redesign menus. The focus of the report was more on product design for food manufacturing, but I think it works really, really well for menus. And a lot of the principles in there kind of overlap with a lot of other things that are out there around this, which I'll touch on at the end. So this framework brings together 4 elements, and I'll just go through those now quite quickly. They should all be fairly familiar. Next slide, please. So the first one is the foundation piece. It's the need to source regeneratively as much as possible. So this is very much about the fact that you can have 2 dishes with exactly the same ingredients and they can have completely different impacts. And so in terms of how you go about doing this, I could talk for a long time. So I'll just kind of summarize it as a high level. It's about sourcing locally and seasonally as much as possible. organic or from other agroecological farming systems. And really having a relationship with farmers and suppliers is a really good way to try and work out how you can support them with your ingredient sourcing. Next slide, please. So this is now on to the choice of ingredients as opposed to how they're sourced. And this is the first of those kind of design opportunities in terms of that ingredient choice on your menus. And this one is about making those swaps between ingredients that are high impact to those that have lower impacts. The one that normally comes to mind is animal products, and that's very, very important. And there's a lot of debate and discussion about this in terms of how you go about it. And I like to sum it up with the phrase source less but better. So again, going back to that regenerative sourcing, it's about organic, free range, pasture fed. And for things like chicken and pork, there's lots of really amazing innovative farms in the UK that are trying to go soya free. And that's a really powerful way of having an impact. It's also about making those swaps to the less. So that's the less part of the less the better. And that's using things like legumes and protein sources. I think we're still on lower impact, sorry. But I'll just finish up on that one, which is that it's not just about animal products and swapping them to plant-based products. It's also about swapping from high impact plant species to lower impact ones. So for example, wheat flour to pea flour can be a really beneficial thing. Peas help farms because they can fix nitrogen and reduce artificial fertilizer use, which is fossil fuel based. And it's also about seafoods. A lot of, I don't know about you, but I used to eat just about 5 different types of seafoods, despite the fact that there are about 300 edible species on our coast in the UK. And taking those the pressure off the higher impact species is really important. So switching to things like mussels and seaweed and smaller species of fish. Next slide, please. So yes, now this is the one that has kind of been touched on, which is about how do we make the most of everything in the kitchen. But it's also about making the most of everything that's actually produced on farms and fisheries. So part of this is about upcycling what you might not be currently using in your kitchen. So for example, using the entire cauliflower from the leaves to the core. It could be talking to farmers and suppliers and working out is there things that they are producing that are going to waste. So for example, brewery grain is a great source of flour. Or using fruit that's considered too ugly for retail, for example, and sourcing that for your kitchen as a sweetener instead of sugar. Next slide, please. So this is my favourite one, and this is about using diverse ingredients. And I kind of touched on this with the other ones. I think this is where you can be really innovative and have a lot of fun, particularly if you're talking to local farmers and trying to source different varieties. So for example, of tomatoes and potatoes, there's lots and lots of varieties out there. And by using these more diverse varieties, you can actually help the regenerative system on farms, because a lot of them are pest resistant, for example, or are very adapted to the particular soils and less inputs are needed. But it's also about using different species. So for example, if you're looking at switching to a plant-based option on the menu, instead of just using soya, it's looking at what other legumes are out there, what other plants are out there, and trying to source again locally as possible. Next slide, please. So the report that I mentioned kind of looked at this in terms of in practice, what's the effect that this would have if all these elements were incorporated. And it basically found that for 3 main commodities that we looked at, which was wheat, dairy and potatoes, when you combine all of these elements, so you're doing better sourcing as well as choosing different ingredients, then your impacts compared to simply better sourcing are much, much greater. So that graph might be a bit small to see, but it's across biodiversity, greenhouse gas emissions, and at the farm level, you're also supporting higher total farm output through that diversity of ingredients that is reflected at the farm level, and also higher farming profitability. And that's really important at the moment. There's lots in the news, particularly around fresh fruits and vegetables, about farms who are really struggling. Next slide, please. And this is just, I mentioned a lot about farms, and it's just to remind that these principles are much easier to adopt if you talk to farmers, if you have that positive relationship with them, because you understand what kind of ingredients supports positive outcomes for nature, for example, and you can support them to diversify, so producing lots of different types of crops, for example, and you really get that that link between the customer, your menu, and the farms that you're sourcing from, and the fisheries as well. So, for example, you can get really creative. I mentioned in terms of like a burger, for example, a soya burger. You might be switching from a meat burger to a burger based on fava beans, for example, that have been produced in the UK, alongside potentially things like carrot peel that could be used in the burger. That's upcycling. Next slide, please. And this is just a graphic that kind of gets across what you can do. So again, on one side, you've got what we currently have now, where we're often using fewer ingredients, really high reliance on major commodities like wheat and chicken that's fed on soya, and the landscape as a result is kind of how we're shaping it based on those choices. And on the other side, it's where you're diversifying your menu, and the colours kind of brighter, suggesting that you're sourcing more regeneratively. And it's just a kind of reminder that your menus can really shape landscapes. It's a way of thinking that I think is really helpful, and it really is the case. Next slide, please. So I just thought I'd end with a few places to look for further information. So this is the study that I mentioned. It is focused mostly on how we can redesign food products in terms of food manufacturing. But again, as I say, I think it's really, really helpful to look at in terms of menu redesign. And then next slide, please. And I wanted to highlight a really great case study. And so this is a campaign during COP26 in Glasgow, where restaurants were kind of given the challenge to use some of these principles of circular design. And the idea was that it can feel kind of overwhelming to know where to start. So it was saying, try and make at least one dish or drink on your menu that uses these principles. And there was a list of farms that existed not too far away from Glasgow that restaurants could get in touch with, and there were some really amazing menu ideas that came out of this. And the photos there are some examples of ones which use upcycling, for example. So the chocolate one used cocoa bean husks that aren't normally used, and then the middle one's using the entire cauliflower from the core to the leaves, and the drink is containing vodka that uses grape seeds and skins that aren't normally used to form that drink. Next slide, please. But in terms of a really good resource specifically on the hospitality industry, in terms of how do you adopt these principles, and with lots of case studies, London has done a fantastic resource that we were also involved in from 3 years ago, and that doesn't just cover menu redesign. It goes a bit further, for example, in terms of your energy use and how you can deal with food waste, for example, by having different bins to try and help you work out where the waste is coming from. So I really recommend that as a great resource. And there's one more resource on my last slide, and that's eating better. And that's particularly really good in terms of providing advice on how to work towards more of those plant-based dishes, which is so important, and the innovation and kind of creativity and fun that you can have around that. Brilliant, that's it, thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Louise. I love the opportunity that food gives us to start to regenerate and increase biodiversity. So it's about doing good and not just being less bad. I think that's fantastic. Thank you so much. So now it's time to welcome our final speaker before we take a break. So hang in there a little bit longer. I know we've given you a lot of information very quickly, but I'm delighted to introduce Angela and Jacob from Silent Night, who are going to speak to us a bit about the design and redesign principles that they used. So take it away, Caroline.
Yes, welcome, and thank you, Danny, for inviting us to this really exciting, inspiring event. So I hope you don't go to sleep while we're talking about mattresses. But yes, if you can just go to the next slide, what I'm just going to do is I'll introduce myself and Silent Night, and then I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jake. So I head up ESG, Environmental Social Governance at Silent Night, and Jake joined us through the Knowledge Transfer Partnership funded by Innovate UK about 3 years ago, looking at fire chemistry, which he's going to talk to you a little bit about. But now Jake is a full-time materials research and knowledge manager, which is fundamental to manufacturing businesses, I think, going forward. So just real quick about Silent Night. We are a brand leader, about 10% market share. Our factory is not quite as pretty as some of the Austral brewery sites that you were looking at, but here we are, an old weaving shed in the east of Lancashire that now employs 800 people. We're really a big part of the community because the town's quite a rural location with about 12,000 people. So the business and the community are quite well kind of embedded it, and we like to support each other. We produce about 10 to 15,000 mattresses every single week. And we are mass market sleep solutions for all the family, and you'll find the Silent Night brand in all the channels. We're just, because we won the Whitbread Premiering contract just last year, it's meant that we're bigger in hospitality than we used to be, and actually that's going to be a focus for us going forward. And I think it's a real opportunity to actually start driving the circular economy, because we can look at reverse logistics, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So next slide, please. So I think a few people have touched on, it's like, where do you start? And it's like this massive kind of challenge, and it's really complex. And I think if you are just starting on the journey, what really helped us enormously was to find some specialists. So we started working with a company called Oakdean Hollins back in about 2016. Who specialise in this, and they've really held our hand and helped us think a bit longer term, because if you think, businesses tend to think very short term, you know, what's happening this week, this month, this year, as do governments, and as do we as a species. You know, it's really hard for us to think long term. You know, we're better at sort of handling balls being thrown at us on a daily basis. So I think this has been a mindset shift in the business to actually start talking about 2040. And if you just, next slide, please, I'm just going to go through some of the things that we're looking at. So we've set off by, oh, sorry, we can just go back one, by starting with our net zero plan, which we worked on with Oakdean. We've got a science-based targets validated plan, and that's really helped focus a lot of what we're going to talk about today. But as we know, emissions are only kind of half the story. A lot of it is about moving to the circular economy. As an industry, we would really support the government introducing an extended producer responsibility scheme, an EPR scheme, because we kind of generally, we manufacture something, but we lose it because it gets sold on to other people, it ends up in people's homes, and it's difficult to get it back. Hospitality changes that a little bit because we have got that relationship ongoing. And we're a bit disappointed really that DEFRA have now kind of almost put on hold any plans to introduce an EPR scheme, which they had been talking about for 2025. So we need to work as an industry together to think about how we can accelerate this without the government's help at the moment. But even without an EPR scheme, eco-design principles are kind of fundamental. And we've started rethinking our products from the materials we use, the way we put them together, thinking about deconstruction. Jake's going to talk about a lot about this. So it's things like modular design, it's about lightweighting the materials, and it's about monomaterials, so there's no contamination and mix between natural materials and technological materials so that you can separate them easier. And another thing that's really helped us on our journey is start to introduce carbon literacy training across the business, just so that people can kind of see the picture, understand it more, and then start to think how they can apply it to their business, their community, and their lives. So next slide, please. So I talked so that one of the biggest challenges, as I say, is what happens when mattresses at end of life, because you've got all that wealth of material, and whether it's metals, springs, or it's polyesters or foams or wools or whatever. And currently there's about 7 million mattresses become kind of past their usable kind of date in the UK every year. And unfortunately, only about 1 million of them are actually going to responsible recyclers. There are about 8 really good recyclers. We work with about half of those across the country. And we know that we can, that the materials that are being reclaimed, and Jake will talk about that a little bit more. But there's still about 6 million either getting landfilled, tipped, as people see flighted mattresses around the countryside. Some of those become energy for waste, which is okay, but not ideal. And actually mattresses are not really good in the incineration system because they kind of clog everything up. And currently the government are picking up the cost of this, because most people, consumers, getting rid of a mattress, they tend to just use ring the local council up, ask if they can take the mattress away. They say, yes, give us a tenner, put it outside your door. They come about 2 weeks later, by which time it's wet, dirty, and what would have been useful for recycle value isn't, which is why we're really keen to introduce, get an EPR scheme introduced, as they've got in France, is running really well, been going about 10 years now, but there's also other examples throughout other parts of the world. So next slide, please. So I'm now going to hand over to Jake, who's actually going to talk through some of the materials and some of the challenges that we've got. So over to you, Jake.
Thank you, Angela. Yeah, so I thought I would quickly start with the anatomy of a mattress, because more often than not, people just buy one online or from a shop, and then it just sits in their room and they use it for 8 to 10 years and then get rid of it and don't really think about it. So actually there's a few different components that go into a mattress. So first of all, you have your quilted sleep surface. So that is typically a knitted or woven fabric which is quilted to a polyester wadding. And then for us, because we're using a synthetic fiber along with polyester, actually we can recycle that trim waste in the factory, and that can get sent back to our suppliers and turned into some new components. Below that, you have a comfort layer, and that's typically a natural or synthetic fiber or foam. And this is sort of where you can tailor the mattress to the sleeper's needs, but it's also the limiting factor in product lifetime due to issues that I'll come on to shortly. And then you have your support unit, so that's the springs or the pocket springs or foam, and this dictates the firmness of your mattress, and which is key for spinal alignment and is directly proportional to people's weight, height, and hip circumference. And then we have a spring insulator pad, which is to stop the metal of the springs from chipping into your expensive comfort layers and degrading them even quicker. And these are produced from our trim quilted waste. So we generate about 250 tons of spring insulator pads every year from our own fabric materials that have been offcuts. And then finally, you have to have the rest of all your mattress encased together. Next slide, please. So sort of 3 years ago now, Premier Inn put out a brief for a new bed, and what they were asking for is it's got to be comfortable. They have a good night's sleep guaranteed. It has to be a durable bed, so that good night's sleep guarantee has to be there for the full lifespan of the bed, which is typically for them is 6 years. So that's really important to them. And then it has to be versatile as well. So they're wanting, for some of their rooms, there'll be a twin bed one night, and then they want to be able to join them together to be a super king the next. So they need some versatility in there. And then also they wanted the bed to help deliver their net zero strategy, which is a 50% reduction in Scope 3 emissions by 2035. Next slide, please. So we went back and started looking at, went all the way back to basics with a mattress. And as I said earlier, that you have this idea of comfort layers are the bits that have the shortest lifetime. So how could we separate out the comfort layer from the spring layer, or the spring unit, which lasts much longer, 12 plus years, maybe even 20. Whereas the comfort layers, typically you start to see settlement after 6 years. Just the next animation, please, not full slide. And this also allows us to meet versatility and comfort. So if we're talking about it being a twin room, if you have a topper, then you're going to be able to join the two support units together with a Super King topper, offering that versatility. And you're not going to have that ridge down the middle, which is going to impede on comfort. And then to the next animation, please. So actually, when we then had an LCA done on this, on what the one-piece design compared to a modular design where your topper is zipped on and off. And what we saw is over a 12-year life cycle, so you're getting 2 toppers over that period of time, but the spring unit remains in place for the full duration. We see a 23% saving in greenhouse gas emissions. Next slide, please. So that sort of was really useful to separate out to get to that modular design, but also we wanted to have a look at how we could then better design the comfort layers particularly for a hospitality need where you've got a high turnover of customers and you need to meet that comfort guarantee for that full lifetime. So we considered some natural materials, so sheep's wool, polyester wadding and polyurethane foam. So sheep's wool's got this lovely sort of natural story. It's derived from nature. It's considered compostable, but that's not carried out at scale. And as soon as you mix it with a synthetic, which would typically be polyester or polylactic acid, you start to get issues of you be introducing microplastics into your composted waste. And then it has a few sort of other issues like settlement, and actually it's got really high associated greenhouse gas emissions. So we then also had a look at synthetic fibers, which is polyester. Typically it's oil derived, but there is really good ways of it being recycled. So mechanical recycling is up and running and chemical recycling is on the way, and both can be sort of being carried out at scale. But again, we're seeing settlement issues. The greenhouse gas emissions are lower, and if you start to introduce mechanical recycled content, then you really are going to drive down those greenhouse gas emissions even further. But actually for Premier Inn's need, probably the best thing for them was to actually look at a polyurethane foam, despite it being oil derived, and currently there's having limited recycling options, partially due to the chemical flame retardants that go into foam. It's resilient, it's durable, you're going to meet that guarantee, you're going to meet your comfort guarantees. And as a virgin material, it actually has quite a low greenhouse gas emission. Next slide, please. So this is sort of just summing up that without there's no such thing as a perfect material without a system in place to make it circular, and that's a really important take-home message. Next slide, please. So by going down the route of synthetics, I sort of wanted to talk a bit more about plastic waste management. So on the right, we just have a few things that we can do a few things that happen to plastics in terms of end of life, or to reduce end of life and keep them in circulation for longer. And what we're showing is that there's an increasing environmental impact depending on which option you use. And the very worst thing that can happen with any sort of material is it goes to landfill, because you're getting indefinite real material loss. There's a really high risk of that waste leaking out into the environment, and any chemical additives it has leaching out into the environment and causing issues further down the line. So the next best thing really that can ever happen is incineration, which is where you're going to get one extra cycle of some benefit from that material, but then it's indefinitely lost again. So an area that's really growing and is slightly close to my heart as someone who did a chemistry degree is chemical recycling. And that is typically and historically been seen as the recycling of blended and low value plastics, but it's really having a lot of capital investment currently by lots of recyclers. You then have mechanical recycling, which is closing the loop on what's considered high value plastics, such as polyester, polypropylene, and different polythenes. But what can we do what can we do as a manufacturer in the very first place is to start to think about reuse. So designing our products for longer life and increased utilization. So keeping that spring unit in place is a really good example of that for a longer period of time. And then there's prevention and reduction. So how can we prevent the use of any material that we are using and reduce single use and unnecessary plastic use? So what I'm going to do now is just go a little bit deeper into chemical recycling, because I think it's a really important tool that's going to facilitate the circular economy. So along the bottom, we have a product life cycle to make a plastic product. So typically you have some form of hydrocarbons or petrochemicals that then get turned into monomers, which combine to make polymers, which can then be processed into making some sort of plastic product or packaging. And then eventually they end up in a recycling scheme post-consumer. So then we go back up, and you've got ideally you'd want to reuse or mechanically recycle it, but if not, then the next best option really is to go down chemical recycling. And the best option for chemical recycling is purification. And that's what you see now with some plastic bottles, is that so Biff Pack will now, when they melt plastic bottles down, and turn them into flake. After they've gone into that flake, they then melt it in an inert atmosphere, which helps keep the polymer chains longer and remove any sort of toxic, contaminants. Then we have depolymerization, which is what's currently happening with polyurethane foam in Europe. So they are able to take polyurethane foam mattresses and depolymerize those. From that, they get the polyol out, and they're able to then turn that back into new mattresses. And we're now seeing that polyol coming into the UK. But the issue is we can't use UK foam in that because of the chemical flame retardants, because they contain chlorinated chemicals which go and contaminate the reaction process, and they contain melamine, which creates a gelling sort of gunk which wrecks the apparatus. So the very best thing that can sort of happen for UK foam at this present moment in time is feedstock recycling, where the idea would be is it can go through a pyrolysis treatment and you get some sort of useful hydrocarbon or petrochemical at the end of it, and then you'd have to put all the energy back in to turn it into new product. So if we go to the next animation, please. So the take-home message from here is that the use of chemical flame retardants limit recycling of upholstered furniture. And again, we've seen that in the domestic seating, with domestic seating, where waste up to upholstered domestic seating is now being sent to incineration because of persistent organic pollutants that have been put into it to make it meet the UK's fire regulations in the past. Next slide, please. So just to do a little bit more on banging the drum for Europe and their ability to recycle polyurethane foam, there was a really interesting academic study that came out earlier this year that went and took a foam that they created in a lab, and then they were able to extract that polyol that makes up part of the foam and turn it back in using 100% recycled polyol into that foam and create an infinite loop. But they do note that one of the problems with why you can't get 100% recycled polyol into a new foam in actually mass scale and turning it into something that's we could use in an industrial setting is the fact that all these different companies that create polyurethane foam use their own different methods and different recipes. So when you have a waste stream where you don't know what's coming in, you end up with an inferior product because there's a mix of different polyols. So next animation, please. So really, it's just to sum it up, it says to achieve a circular economy, we need to get the basics right. So product passports and extended producer responsibility will enable products to become circular and keep recycler at a higher value. Next slide, please. So just some conclusions from what we've sort of found when we're looking at circular materials and trying to create a truly circular mattress is that, firstly, there is no perfect material, only a perfect system, or a system that facilitates that. The current and proposed UK furniture and furnishings fire safety regulations are really limiting the recycling of UK furniture to, at best, a downcycling model. Synthetic materials generally have mechanical recycling systems already in place, and there's large capex expenditure going on to invest in chemical recycling and make that better. Natural materials currently have very limited recycling pathways, and if they're mixed with a synthetic material, then it becomes even more limited. And as a manufacturer, I love the expression of where there's muck, there's brass, but we have a responsibility to put the brass in place first time round because it's a circular economy. So the most important thing is that there is value there for the recyclers. And then finally, we need to improve material segregation and recycling rates, which could be facilitated by an EPR scheme and product passports. And then I just wanted to highlight some of the furniture industry's current collaborations with academia around the circular economy. So the National Bed Federation, which is the mattress industry's trade body, has got a knowledge transfer partnership with Manchester Metropolitan University to develop a robust cleanliness of fillings test to enhance component reuse and recycling. And then we at Silent Night are currently funding a PhD studentship with UCLAN to further understand the fire behaviour of upholstery fires in domestic and non-domestic settings, so that we can hopefully drive down chemical flame retardant use even further within our industry. Thank you very much.
That was brilliant. Thank you very much, Angela and Jake. I think the way that you've redesigned and rethought the way your mattresses are made is really inspiring. And it's also great to grapple with some of these challenges to the circular economy and circular economy implementation. We're going to be drawing those into our working groups and future activity. Quick apology to Angela and Carolyn, because I realise I did muddle your names in my last introduction. Anyone who missed that clearly needs a break as much as I do. It is time. Thank you so much for your attention so far. Let's take 15 minutes, walk away from your screen, stretch your legs, go to the loo, and we'll start again at 11 o'clock. Think up some questions, because there's nothing in the Q&A so far. So I'm really looking forward to an engaged audience when we come back. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody, or more or less everybody. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to us this morning and to hear what our speakers have to say. Hopefully you've come away with perhaps a deeper understanding of the circular economy, and certainly some inspiration on the ways that it can be applied in very different ways across different aspects of hospitality businesses. I don't think we've got any questions at all in the Q&A. So, oh no, hold on, we have. Lovely. So we'll start with those. And what we'll do is, if you'd like to turn on your camera and your video and ask a question, please use the raise your hand function at the top of the screen. So if you know where the chat function is, it's just a few along from there. And we'll take questions both in that way and in the Q&A as well. So starting with the first one, we've got upcycling and downcycling processes are creating a lot of unuseful products, maybe too many in the last time. Conversions of products, components, materials with their own life cycle. Hold on. Recycling is referring to the refabrication of the same product. Why use upcycling and downcycling instead of material recovery? I don't know if I've got a volunteer to respond to that. And we've got a further question from the same person. What about the biological recycling of synthetic materials also? So quite a lot in that one, but commenting on the recycling, why use upcycling and downcycling instead of material recovery? And what about biological recycling? I'm looking to my panel for volunteers.
I can talk from a construction point of view, and construction, it's probably easier really to use those terms. Downcycling anyway. I do struggle with upcycling sometimes, because upcycling to me thinks, oh, you're having a sort of a better better product than you originally had, really. But very much in construction, downcycling is when we lose the value in the material or product. So crushing up glass as aggregate, but going back into glass. And I think that's just really, really important, because otherwise everything just gets lumped in as recycling, whereas there's obviously sort of very much different shades of recycling, and we want to try and push that sort of value of recycling upwards as much as possible. Obviously, though, you know, looking at the context of a project, because sometimes recycling can potentially expend more energy, you know, if you're going to be transporting aggregates, construction waste a long way to make aggregates, that may not be worthwhile. But that's kind of from a construction point of view. I don't know if that was helpful. I don't know about biological recycling of synthetics, so I'm not going to even attempt that.
That's great. Thanks, Catherine. Fiona, I can see you've got your hand up if you'd like to come in on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of kind of misconceptions around recycling and the terms associated with it. And I think a lot of recycling is downcycling. There's a very small percentage of recycling that's actually what I'd call closed loop recycling. So returning the original product or material to the same value as it was. A lot of it is use for kind of lower value application areas. But I think also in terms of, you know, the difference between material recovery and recycling, I think is a lot of it is to do with the scale and the effort in the application area. So ideally we would want to be recovering materials in their current form, because recycling essentially is breaking everything down into its lowest value, and then it's actually really difficult to recover, particularly if you're not looking at pure kind of material recycling. You're looking quite often at a lot of mixed materials that come out of the recycling sort of process or the destruction process, so it's harder to recapture kind of those valuable materials. So ideally we're looking at material recovery, but at scale that's very difficult. So I think you've got that kind of the contradiction between scale and then value. And I wonder with the bio question, or the biological recycling synthetic materials, I don't know whether Jake has got any insights on that one.
Yeah, well, I guess if you think about it, like there's the talk of from Portsmouth University, and I think it's Plymouth, isn't it, on enzymes that can break down plastics, but they're still in their infancy. So it's not sort of at a scale that is to be used in any sort of reactors currently. And then I guess you have sort of these semi-synthetics like viscose fibers, so things like rayon. And there's a company called Tencel. They now have a way of recycling that when it's been blended with cotton, and that's a product that they now launch. So basically, it uses it's a cellulose fiber that gets blended back down chemically into a new fiber, again, that's cellulosic, so it does rot if it goes into landfill. But I think generally for synthetics, there's always been this drive that you need to keep them sort of. If you're taking a raw material that's oil derived, you don't want to like degrade it down too far.
Thank you, Jake. Miss Saya, sorry, I'm not sure how to say your name, but I saw that you had your hand up. Did you want to comment at all before we move on from your question? I can't hear you. Hand's going up and down. I can't hear you, Miss Saya. Okay, I think we'll move on to the next question in that case. So are there any barriers for material reuse? The question specifically about construction, but I think it's probably applicable more widely than that as well. Again, I've got an open floor for the panelists on that one.
Yeah, there's lots of barriers to material reuse, largely because construction's just very set up for recycling, so it's the reuse is not the norm. So you've got the practical elements of just being able to reuse materials, which is being able to get them out in the building, knowing what they are. Some may need re-warranting, certification. A really good example is fire doors. So you'll go into sort of, lots of buildings, they're going to refurbish, they're going to sort of, take all the fire doors away and put new ones in, and that you can't reuse those fire doors which have been sitting there perfectly adequately for all that time, unless you've got all the warranties and certifications and they're used in the same, exactly the same area. So there's issues with that. And there's also, some projects start with quite grand ambitions, but as soon as you get to procurement and contracts, and I think the brewery guys kind of said this to some aspects, all the ambitions can just sort of, vanish really. And there's a risk factor, there's a supply and demand factor. So, but saying all that, there's a lot more interest and a lot more is happening, but I think you have to pick your wins almost and sort of the baby steps. But I think the brewery chaps may want to say something to that.
Only, yeah, completely reiterating what you're saying. I think a lot of the issues that we're finding, or the challenge that we're getting, is about fire regulations on materials or noting, especially in a building that's just burned down, noting a lot of concern about making sure that we have the right certification, and what we can reuse and how we can reuse it. And if we've got contaminated products, how we can reuse that within the cycle and show the right things in order to pass building control. It's just a lot of hurdles, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, and I was just going to add that piece around supply and demand, is that as far as I'm aware, there isn't that go-to marketplace for that sharing of materials. So we have to kind of check free sites on Facebook, and maybe our contractors will know a little bit, and what you do with the storage, how do you plan for people to come and collect the stuff that you're taking out of your site? Where do you, I mean, we're on the edge of a harbour, how do you plan for big trucks to come down? It's these sort of behavioural infrastructure things that we just are not set up for just yet. I mean, we were just talking about insulation. We would love to be able to reuse insulation from an existing building into a new one, but we can't currently do that because of regulations. How do we plan for that, and how do we make that possible?
Okay, thank you. So moving on to the next question, which is around digitalisation and how this is helping plan and decarbonise supply chains, again, in construction and manufacturing. But I think we could probably go more widely than that again.
I can say a bit from construction. So you're seeing quite a lot in the digital space in construction now. That quite a lot of construction projects do BIM anyway, so that's a sort of a basis. You're seeing a lot more platforms that are starting to happen, which is sort of the material passport type platforms that then feed into your digital marketplaces. It's a bit embryonic, and I just think with all these sort of different platforms, you need the critical mass to make it work, really. But I think what the issue is as well, there's no real standardization when it comes to all the data and information that you need to collect. That's true for construction, probably other sectors as well. So it's also a bit of a wild, wild west. So we kind of need to sort of it's not rocket science, I don't think, but yeah, we just need to make it a bit more standard.
I mean, thank you. Does anybody else want to come in on that one?
So I think from sort of furniture, there's this whole idea of there is a big push towards product passports. There's a company called R that are investing in quite heavily in that technology, or to facilitate people with that technology. And that would be sort of, you would have a permanent label on a piece of upholstery that has a QR code or an RFID tag underneath it, so that you're able to scan that for the recycler at end of life. But also it could be used to promote for a consumer to take them down the route of using a responsible recycler. And but there's always been this fear of, how do you stop someone from just being able to scan it to get proprietary information? So there is a level of complexity there that needs to be worked out.
Thank you. Go on, Angela.
Yeah, sorry, just to add to what Jake's just said, I mean, just from our own industry's point of view, I mean, we are one of 200 mattress manufacturers in the UK. Almost anybody can set up as a mattress manufacturer in a garage or whatever, because you're an assembler, not really a manufacturer. And I think whilst we work with our trade organisation, and one or two of the other big suppliers do, there are just so many SMEs that just don't have the resource. So that's one area. A lot of them aren't even kind of, there's no regulation about what they're doing, and they're not following things they should be doing. So that's a concern, but they haven't got the resource to move on, even if they want to. And then there's a whole issue of kind of, you're doing your, as we put our emissions onto our bill of materials, but it's kind of like where you're getting that data from. And there's no kind of standard to draw from when you're trying to look at product passports. And but I think it's just about pushing for change, coming together, collective action, which is why events like these are amazing. It's good for us to hear what other industries are doing, because you do tend to get a bit kind of siloed in your own industry. But yeah, it's all about that collective and pushing, and sort of some of the bigger companies, which is hopefully that's what we're doing, are trying to help some of the smaller companies by saying, you know, we found this useful, you might find it useful too. And I think that's where trade organisations have got a real role to play in the future, in helping make it more accessible to smaller companies, if that helps.
Great, thank you very much. I've got a question in the chat for Catherine. It's quite a long one. I'm going to read it out. What do you think about coarse sand derived from glass bottles, also known as eco sand, to be used in construction? I understand that up to 40% of sand can be replaced with this material. What do you think? And what about mollusk shells and other calcium carbonate rich materials for concrete usage? London produces a lot and still gets this material from outside the city while they get burned in the incinerator.
Yeah, it's quite a techie question on eco sand. I'll have to look into it, because I don't want to say it's good or bad for not looking into it. But you know, I think generally it's good obviously to use our waste materials in applications, but I think with concrete sometimes you have to be careful, because it's just seen as a sink for lots of other materials, which then may affect their performance, and you can only see what's happened, you know, with all the rack concrete at the moment. So I just think, you know, it's making sure that we use those waste materials in the most efficient way, and you know, and it helps the performance of those materials. There are examples. Brighton University did a waste house quite a long time ago now, but they crushed up mollusk shells, I think they were mussel shells, and used them for a really nice sort of tiling application. So yeah, it's that sort of industrial symbiosis piece. And I don't think construction's that good at looking for materials outside other sectors, to tell the truth. So, but it's also knowing what's around as well, isn't it?
Okay, thank you. I see Fiona's putting some comments in the chat as well, so take a look at those. And there was a question on, where's it gone? Okay, is there a repository of organisations which recycle not just mattresses, but a wide range of materials which we seek to recycle? And I would invite everybody who's on the call, if you know anything about that, to get into the chat and respond. In the Q&A, we've got a question around the use of the term recycling as being a legacy term from the linear economy. So with the introduction of the new design for recycling standards, what are your thoughts on, do we keep the use of this term recycling and talk about upcycling and downcycling, or perhaps should we use another term, and conversion is the term that's been suggested? Sort of welcome your thoughts on that.
I think in construction, you've just got to use language that people understand to get people on board, and that language may differ to who you're talking to in the supply chain. I mean, recycling is a better understood term. I think if I started to talk about conversion to people, they'd look like I just don't think that, and you know, I think it would take such explanation that they would probably just sort of, you know, just give up understanding me. So I do think language is really sort of critical, and we probably don't think about it enough, actually, in terms of I don't anyway. I know I'm a bit guilty of that, in terms of sort of how we express some of the concepts to our supply chain.
I think the use of language is a really good point, and using language that can be understood is perhaps the most important key thing. I'm going to take one last question before we move on to our next speakers. So we've got John Cunningham. I welcome you.
I'll come off mute. Can you hear me?
We can.
Hi everyone, I'm John Cunningham. I'm from the Food Service Equipment Association, a trade body for people who provide commercial kitchen equipment. Dishwashers, commercial fridges, cooking, warming, that sort of thing. And I'm interested just in that last point about terminology. it can be a bit baffling. And as you said, I think it was Catherine said, you know, if I talked about conversion, people wouldn't really get it. And I think in our sector, so food service equipment, high energy users, but also a lot of stainless equipment when you go into a commercial kitchen. So we are thinking about, and the industry actually pleasingly is really on top of and moving the right direction in terms of thinking about sustainability, thinking about footprint, thinking about supply, thinking not just about that whole recycle and what happens post product, if you like, but also thinking about pre-product before you create it with the right materials. So lots of good stuff going on, but it's a bit blinding when you talk about net zero 2035, sustainable development goals, and recycling, upcycling, downcycling, conversion, and the language of it all. So what I'm leading towards is the FEA has taken a view, we need to provide some training to get people in our sector to really understand and navigate all this stuff, because although at a high level, hopefully we're all committed to sustainability within that, and there's been some great slides actually during the sessions today, it just shows that it's a minefield. There's quite a lot of complexity when you start to dig into this. So we feel there needs to be a common understanding of what do we mean by all of that in order to really drive good practice. So I just wanted, I suppose, to turn it into a question, but what are your thoughts around training and education and common understanding in your respective sectors? Are we there yet? And if so, how might this, we're talking to a university here, how might we pull that all together and be a bit better educated in terms of what should we be doing? Thoughts?
Thank you, Ellen, Caroline.
I think this is a really good question. I think training plays a part. You almost need to flip it, and you have to make this really successful. You need to make the circular economy profitable for business, which I know is an oxymoron. You have to make that's the only thing that's going to drive this. Particularly when we're talking from a brewery, we're a £200 million turnover business. We have a lot of energy and resource and support behind this, but it has to be commercial. And I think when we're talking about it's almost sort of understanding, and we're talking about people who are buying this, we're designing, etc. But it almost needs to go right to the very top and say this circular way of working is of benefit to your business for these reasons. So, for example, got our ovens on a repair contract, so they'll repair them for 10 years, and then if they can't repair them anymore, then we'll recycle them, and that makes business sense for us. So it's embedding those at all stages, and I think start at the very top, and like there is commerciality in this, and once you start doing that, then you can absolutely give everybody a kind of base level training of what's going on and the decisions you need to make, but did in the actual kind of business planning and how it makes sense to people making those commercial decisions to start with.
Great, thank you. Fiona.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And obviously I would say this coming from university, but I think education is key to all of this. But I think it's education at the right level. So we, for example, run an online masterclass in the circular economy that's well attended by businesses from all sorts of different sectors, large manufacturers all the way through to kind of small SMEs and innovators. And that course is really aimed at helping businesses to understand the circular economy and how they can identify new value creation opportunities, and then how to actually apply it at the business and business strategy level. So I think, courses like that are fantastic to get that kind of overall understanding and increase that awareness and understanding. However, I think when you then come to specific sectors, there's so much that's required in terms of kind of legislation and the standards, and really understanding what you can do within your sector and what's available to help you, but also what the key barriers are, is more, I would say, a kind of at a trade level or more kind of your training and CPD, but I really think it's then a combination, and I think us as universities, we need to work more closely with other training providers in particular sectors to make sure we're joining up that piece and then providing kind of that portfolio of education. But yeah, anyone wanting to know more generally about circular economy and how to implement it within your business, then I'd highly recommend the 6-week online masterclass that we run.
Good
Thank
job
you.
for a shout out. Thanks, Fiona.
We'll be providing the link for that later. I'm really sorry because obviously, John, you've asked a really pertinent question and lots of hands have now appeared in the chat. But I'm really conscious that if we don't move on, we're going to run out of time for our other speakers. So can I invite you to put your questions in the chat? Please do continue the conversation on there. We will be pulling all of that off, feeding it into our working groups and our future work. And if there are key questions in there, we'll try and come back to you with a response specifically on those things. So it remains for me to say a huge thank you to the speakers who we've had this morning. I'm aware that some of you need to head off and can't stay for the rest of the session, but it's been absolutely fantastic having you, hearing such a breadth of experience and the different ways that circular economy can be applied in all these different aspects has been so inspiring. So thank you hugely for coming and for giving up your time today. And on that note, let's move on to my colleague, Margot Reynolds. Welcome, Margot. We're going to hear a little bit about how you can measure your circular journey.
Great. Hi, everyone. So I am Margot Reynolds. I am a doctoral researcher at the University of Exeter within the CE Hub, which I'm sure Danny and the rest of them have given a bit of a rundown of what the hub is and what we do. But my research specifically looks at how we can effectively disseminate and govern metrics to enable businesses to transition to circular business models, and doing so in a way that helps to retain and create and shift the value. So that brings me here today to speak with you around the important role of measurement when transitioning to circular business models. And I'm aware that I think on the call there's a mix. I know at the very beginning when we were sort of looking at the competencies of people with circularity in general and circular economy, there are those that are at the start of their journey and those that are further within it. So hopefully there's some takeaways for everyone involved in the call from what I'm going to share today. And I think this is also a nice follow-on from that final question there around the role of language, because I think something that comes up quite frequently in my research and the work that I do is that numbers a lot of the time are a common language for people across across the entire value chain for businesses. So hopefully there's some takeaways in here that are useful for answering that question as well, and continuing that conversation. So the point of today, I want to go through, as you can see on the screen, some of these talking about the significance of measuring for circularity, what does that measurement look like in practice, and then looking at some of the case study examples as well and leaving you with some takeaways. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And the next one, so we'll start on the why. So I think it's always important to sort of provide some background as to why we measure. And I think, as we're all aware, there's a shift from this sort of business-centric way of business to society-centric way of doing business, and with a focus on sustainable practice. And what I mean by that is that a lot of the time when we looked at sustainability and integrating that into business strategy, it's sort of exclusively an add-on or something that's looking at how that sustainability practice can contribute to the financial or legitimacy gains of the business. But now I think in the society-centric point of view, it's sort of we're looking more broadly at what role the business plays in society as a whole, and considering what those potential impacts can look like beyond the financial performance for the firm solely. So what we can see is that businesses are starting to respond to the growing number of external pressures by things like, the SDGs or net zero goals or different sort of regulations and laws. So things like the extended producer responsibility or things around plastics and packaging regulations that are, more and more being pushed in recent years. And businesses are starting to have their policies and practices come into play, but ultimately are falling short a lot of the time in delivering on the demands because they're ultimately still protecting their core profitable linear operations, understandably a lot of the time. And if we go to the next slide, we can see in practice another sort of example here of in last year there was a study done that was looking at the top 25 multinationals that had some sort of net zero goal by whatever respective year they have, and unfortunately the findings came to show us that upon investigation they're much more likely to reach 40% of that goal rather than the claimed 100% reductions. And there's no sort of, and as you can see in the lovely bright red, that there's no firms that are found to have a high integrity of actually reaching those targets that they have set for themselves. And it's things like this in practice that help us, that make us sort of wonder, how can we sort of rectify this issue and the disconnect between policies and practices and well-intended purposes of businesses and then the actual intended outcomes. And that's where I think measurement comes in as a really effective tool in helping us to get there, and helping us to understand and see it not just as a tool that can sort of be static in our annual reports, but can play a more proactive role for businesses in helping to achieve their circular goals. So if we go to the next slide, in literature, a lot around the why for measuring, this is just some sort of generic takeaways, but this idea of helping with decision making and performance assessment, and as well as having an ability to sort of influence externally, so being able to provide, communicate your success and provide transparency to external actors. But the one that I find most interesting is the last point here around being able to make actors within the value chain of your business more responsible. So encouraging greater accountability and acting as more proactive and constructive tools for the business. So this idea, again, that we measure what we value and we value what we measure. So particularly that's pertinent in the case of circularity, when we want to make sure that we're making our employees and those within the value chain have a sense of responsibility in enabling this circularity to be embedded within strategy. And then the next slide looks at beyond literature. A lot of my work looks at working with practitioners and talking with them around what they think is the why for measuring in their circular contexts. And there is a lot of overlap, obviously, with the literature and things like helping to generate movement in the right direction, ensuring accountability and driving decision making, and helping to communicate and report on results. But there are two sort of recurrent ideas on this list that I found that I think are really interesting and particularly relevant for circularity in particular, and intending for a circular future for businesses, is the ability to account for true costs, and then also this last point around creating future scenarios and predictions using real-time data. Because as we know, a lot of the time, a lot of circular practices, evidently their sort of main contributions and benefits to a business are seen over a longer period versus sort of the immediate goals. So being able to sort of see out those predictions and future scenarios using real-time data is really useful. And again, coming back to that point that I raised at the beginning, and that was raised in the Q&A, was this idea that numbers really are a common language across a business, which is a really useful tool when we're trying to, as was said in the Q&A, bring about language that people can understand and can be mutually beneficial for all those involved in the value chain. One point that isn't mentioned on these slides, which is something that I think is really important and interestingly isn't brought up by practitioners without sort of being prompted, although I'm sure it's there at the back of their mind, is this idea that measurement is also a really necessary tool when we're trying to be compliant with regulation and reporting requirements as well. So if we move to the next slide, hopefully that was a little bit of an overview of the why we measure, and in the context of circularity, why it's really pertinent in that case. And I want to talk a bit more about the how that happens in practice. So if we go to the next slide and then one more, we'll skip this one for sake of for our sanity of trying to work through that. But this here, I think, is a really interesting slide and something I know that I think you're receiving these slides afterwards, so feel free to look further into detail of these when you have a chance. But I wanted to take a moment to have a look at the lay of the land, because there are quite a lot of sort of broader influential frameworks that can help guide businesses as they venture into trying to measure for circularity. And so some of the examples on the screen we can see from some international bodies. So the OECD has their 474 indicators that they've deduced for the best ways to measure for circularity. The EU has their list of headline indicators. There are circular transition indicators from the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And then there's also a sort of a step below that is then we've got measurement frameworks and tools from different foundations and consultancies and the like that businesses can and are starting to actively adopt and work alongside to sort of see, measure their circularity. So this is things like Circulytics from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation or Circle Assessment from Circle Economy, Circutelligence from BCG. So there's a whole horde of them out there, but this is just a slide that promotes some of the sort of leading ones that businesses are using and referring to. So again, feel free to look in your own time in more detail about these. But these are some of those tools that we can consider applying when looking at trying to understand the depth and breadth of measures that industries are tackling and tracking for their circular success. And if we go to the next slide, I then wanted to jump down again to the organizational level. And I think from my research, I wanted to share what I've sort of determined as 3 buckets of the measures for consideration when you're heading into measuring success, circular success for your business. So the most prominent sort of bucket of success there is that one in the middle about mean. So this is looking more about the material outputs. So what are the results of implementing your different circular interventions? So what's your degree of raw material circularity? What's your material productivity, your waste management practices, and so on and so forth, life cycle analysis. So those sort of material outputs. And a lot of the time, a lot of general conversation around circular measurement stops here. But I think it's really important that we look at those sort of sandwiching buckets there that are the enablers and the ends. So when we think about enablers, these are the kind of factors that reflect the degree of actual institutional renewal and transition. So things like how educated your employees are, the effective governance that you have in place, the sorts of innovations that are going on in your infrastructure and technology, and things like competitiveness. So the jobs that you're building from this, the actual gross added value, and the financial aspect of the wins from having circular practices in play. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you've got your ends. So this is the outcomes. So what are the changes that can be directly linked to the application of your intervention? So what happens as a result of optimizing those waste management practices or from having an improved material productivity? And this can be further distinguished as contributing to either your social prosperity or looking at environmental protection or conservation or regeneration. And again, these are just buckets that have come out of my research and looking into, I guess, again, just trying to make sense of this. So even just the example of the OECD, like I said, they have 474 indicators. There's upwards of 2,000 in the literature of different indicators out there. So I think it can be really overwhelming when you're first stepping into it. So this is a chance to sort of look at making sure that you're covering all bases that work for you and your business. And then if we go to the next slide, I wanted to just provide very simply just some examples of what that actually might look like as a metric in these different sort of buckets. So again, in enabling, this might look at the number of jobs generated or the percentage of your employees that have completed some sort of circular training within your business. When we're looking at the means, so those material outputs, so resource productivity overall, and what's that reduction in your virgin material inflow, for example. And then in the end side of things, so outcomes. So what are the changes over time? So this is an example of more of the environmental impact in regard to the percentage of your renewable or energy consumption. So that's, again, just I thought it would be good to just highlight a couple of what the metrics will look like when you put pen to paper. So the next slide, we've now gone through in this sort of very fast-paced sort of overview of measuring for the circularity, of the why we measure and the how we measure. And I wanted to also finish up by looking at some case studies in practice right now, and some of the leading examples of businesses that have circular principles that are driving their strategies, that are doing so successfully in regard to the measurements that they have in play currently with their business. So if we go to the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about DS Smith. So they are a British multinational packaging business. I'm sure that all of us are potentially aware of them, but they do packaging solutions, paper products, recycling services. So you can see just by what they do, they're very much well aligned to have a circular mission. So if we go to the next slide, what I've done is have a look at their corporate level strategy, which they call their now and next sustainability strategy. And again, looking back and trying to marry this with the how that I was speaking about before, in looking at the buckets of the enablers and the means and the ends, and sort of seeing how their strategic goals are sort of situated within these buckets. And you can see here, for example, with the enabling, they've got goals like 2025, engaging 100% of their people on circular economy and training 700 of their designers on circular design principles. And if we go to the next slide, we can see in regard to means and the outputs, you've got some of the more sort of material changes that they're hoping for. So 2023, manufacturing 100% reusable and recyclable packaging. And in 2025, optimizing their fiber use for individual supply chains in 100% of new packaging solutions, and so on and so forth. So again, these sort of material outputs that they're hoping for. And then finally, for the ends, we can see that these are, like I said, sort of more of those social prosperity and environmental impact. So the actual outcomes that they're intending to have as a result of these material output changes. So you can see at the top there, in 2025, having 1 billion problem plastics taken off out of supermarket shelves. And then in the very bottom one, an example of one of those more social marker is in 2030, having engaged 5 million people on the circular economy and circular lifestyles through their products. So that's their corporate level strategy. I also wanted to then couple this by then sharing the product level, which I think is really interesting because a lot of the time there's also a disconnect that's apparent between when the corporate sort of layer and their strategic goals, and then what happens when you come down to those in operational positions. So I think DS Smith is a really good example of how they've taken those and moved that to the product level. So we can see on the right-hand side of the screen, they have their circular design principles that they launched in 2020, which is really important when we then look across to their 2021 circular design metrics, which are essentially very much based off of their principles, and it's really important to sort of make sure you have those principles in place to help define the right metrics for your circular interventions. So feel free again in your own time to go into more detail about what these metrics are, and they've got their 8 that they have deduced as the most effective for their product level goals for being able to help achieve those top level now and next sustainability strategy targets for the company. And they also go into more detail about sort of what are the questions that they're asking and helping to achieve those metrics. So yeah, definitely check that out if you're interested. And if we go to the next slide, this is just an example of a client that they have worked with and the outcome of working with them. So you can see the before and the metrics that they're referring to, and you can even see what that packaging looked like versus the after, and we can see that there's a real practical change, and it's really great to be able to quantify those changes so that you can see that on the product level the role that these metrics are playing and helping to really visualize the effectiveness of the transition that they're undertaking with their clients. And then the next slide, this is another example, is Danone, which I'm sure, again, we're all familiar with, the global food and beverage company. And basically, they also have established their sort of 3 pillars of what they call their Danone Renew strategy. I think it's really interesting to have a look, especially at these big multinationals, and seeing how they're sort of revamping their strategies that are really, taking advantage of a lot of these, circular terms and feeding that into their overall strategy, which is great to see, and embedding that. And we can see that for each pillar, Danone actually goes ahead to then define a new set of priorities that you can see on the outside of that circle there. And then they translate that into their mid and long-term objectives, which we can see on the next slide. And I wanted to showcase this. This is just a screenshot from what they call their Danone Nature dashboard. And I think this was really, I wanted to share this because I think something else that comes out of speaking with a lot of practitioners is that need to be able to visualize, and the use of dashboards to be able to summarize the goals and the targets is really useful. And because I think, again, in terms of language, not only just language and how we speak, but again, in reporting language, a lot of people are comfortable with this sort of efficiency language, and so I think it's really important for us to meet people where they're at a lot of the time as well. So you can see here that the way that they're talking about their ambition and their targets is something that can be very easily interpreted, and we can see that they're really making strides in a lot of these areas, which is great to see. And just this is like another cheeky one that I thought was just worth mentioning, just something that I know that Danone is doing, but they are, on top of a lot of these other goals that they have, they're actually linking their managerial bonuses to their carbon dioxide reduction, which they've seen generate a huge reduction in the last 5 years of 42% against a target of 30% initially. So you can really see that, you know, linking money to these targets is a really effective way of making sure that we're seeing changes. And you can see that there's a lot of strides being made in this space. So this slide's just a good example of what reporting can look like when you're looking at circular measurement. So I'll close out with some takeaways, hopefully, from what I've just shared with you all. So first and foremost, making sure that we're taking time to consider metrics as a way of sort of bridging that current disconnect between sort of when businesses have great policies and intentions and practices and making sure that they help to reach those intended outcomes. And then considering the why behind the measurement and making sure that you're not just seeing it as something static that sits in your reports at the end of the year, but trying to think about how you can make it something that's dynamic and proactive for those along your value chain to help to responsibilize them and help them take accountability for achieving these circular goals for the business. And then finally, these buckets that I was speaking about before, just as a way to first and foremost start getting your head around what you might want to be considering for your business in regard to sort of those transition factors and the material outputs and then the ultimate outcomes that come out of that. And at the very end here, these are just some of the lessons learned in practice. And I think the one that I'll close on is obviously that there's no one size fits all. Unfortunately, it would be lovely if it did, but I think that's just the way that it is with circularity, is that there's no one size fits all approach. And it's really important for us to consider the position of where you're implementing these metrics along your value chain as well, because again, with circularity, a lot of the time you're not just dealing with just the core business, but you're looking at multiple actors. So thinking about who does this metric implicate and who is it important to involve in the implementation of that to ensure that you're reaching the overall corporate goal. So I think hopefully that's covered a very quick rip around measurement for circularity. Again, these slides will be available to you, I think. And feel free, on the last slide, I've got my email there, so feel free to shoot me any questions or comments. And I'm happy to sort of share more. I think at this point, in terms of timing, we might be moving on to the next speaker and such, but thank you so much for listening. And again, feel free to reach out if you have any questions for me or put them in the Q&A, and I'm sure Danny can share them with me when the time comes. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Margot, so much. That's an incredibly comprehensive overview in a very short space of time. Lots of details and links in there, so you'll be able to spend some more time on those in your own time, and we'll share them. And of course, if you're not quite ready to implement some of those tools just yet yourself, you can start asking your suppliers for them and prompt a bit of movement through your procurement practices as well. So we're going to move on now. My colleague Alex is going to talk to us a little bit about finance options for circular economy practices.
Hi everyone, I'm Alex Lake, Sector Business Development Manager and also slide pilot for today, so apologies for any slow slide transitions. So now I'm flipping over into going to talk to you a little bit about financing your circular journey, because as Elle said earlier on, you need to make circularity profitable for business, and nothing's going to change in your businesses unless you can actually make it pay. So here I thought I'd give you a little background on really how funding works for a start, so that you don't go chasing down any of the wrong rabbit holes and spending your valuable time looking at the wrong things. And then a little bit about where investment can take place and what you can tap into that's already happening in terms of researching what's best for your business. So let's get into the first thing. So previous life, I have been a funding professional, and basic principles are, first question is why do funders fund? What do they get out of it? And there's always an exchange, as we know. So public funds, if you're going to get anything from government or Europe or anything like that, why are they going to fund you? So first of all, they will fund in order to incentivize change in policy. For example, a solar feed-in tariff from way back then, government wanted to make change, get people to put solar panels on their roofs, and so they put a feed-in tariff in place, and that was good for the lucky people who got in early. And then things like net zero research and innovation. So there were new policies, there was an urgency, so government put some money in and paid people to enact that change. Secondly, to provide support where there is market failure. So looking at housing, offshore wind, electric vehicles. So there isn't a commercial reason to do some of these things yet. Sometimes it doesn't stack up commercially, and sometimes buyers won't buy things unless they are subsidized. So, for example, electric vehicles have some subsidies on them to encourage people to pay for them. Extreme events, as we know, pandemic business grants, that was just a one-off, hasn't happened again and probably never will until some other extreme event happens. PPE supply chain, that is where a lot of the usual procurement rules were waived and broken in order to get PPE supply chains in place, and disaster relief. So grants can be flexible in the right circumstances, but not always. Another reason to fund, for governments to fund, are to maintain heritage, arts and cultural or sporting assets. So you'll see the National Trust funded by government, English Heritage giving grants for updating listed buildings, and Sport England supporting lots of sports initiatives, although you will say that's lottery funded. Yes, it is, but it's also government funded. It could be grants to resolve a health or social issue, for example, vaccine research or apprenticeships or youth opportunities. So, you know, there's a pattern here. And it's really to make things happen where they commercially would not normally happen, or whether there's an emergency to make it happen. Climate change being one of those, and net zero being the watchword in government at the moment. They haven't quite got onto circular economy type language yet, but it's coming. And the reason why it's coming is because they've funded projects like ours, which is the NICER programme, where we've done a lot of research, where we have constant communication with various government departments to feed back our research and our recommendations as to what should happen next. So the picture on the right hand side is really a document put out by Circular Step for the UN, and it's called Mobilising Financing for the Circular Economy. And in that they have put some recommendations for, you know, any government in the world to bring on change through the circular economy. Before we go on to the next slide, I'll say, when do governments not fund? Because that's also important to know. The hospitality industry, food accommodation, tourism is notoriously underfunded by government. And the reason why is because funding would normally create a competitive advantage if given to businesses. So funding instead is given out in terms of business support, to go on courses, to you know, provide apprenticeships in certain types of businesses. And also governments don't fund where projects and initiatives are already commercially viable. So the good example here is the difference in funding between onshore wind funding and offshore wind funding. So offshore is not quite commercially viable yet. So you have a big contracts for difference auction every few years, and companies bid in order to build their wind farms offshore. Onshore, it is commercially viable because it's much easier to install. So there is no government funding for that anymore, but there used to be. So things change, the landscape changes a lot. So that's at a very macro level, just to help you to understand why your government is or isn't funding you, and why you can or can't get grants for certain things. So talking about this document here, Mobilising Financing for the Circular Economy, in there is this this table, which talks about sustainable finance instruments and their relevance for the circular economy. I won't go into that in any great detail because this is at a very macro level, and And really it's to show you what's happening behind the scenes that will eventually filter down into your investment choices and your lives in the future. So instruments like green bonds, transition bonds, sustainability linked loans and bonds, and ESG investing, you're probably starting to see those products arrive and be advertised by your banks and investment organizations. And their relevance for the circular economy is in this table here. Over on the right-hand side is just a little example of some of the work that's mainly happening in Europe around banking and finance organizations getting together to work out what products they can be offering to support the circular economy. This is quite old. This is a group of people a group of organizations who got together to work out various banking and finance products. And just looking at the logos, I can see one or two there that have actually been on our Circular Economy Masterclass and are still sending people on our Circular Economy Masterclass. So that sort of training angle that's often funded by government feeds back into what companies start to do and how they invest in initiatives that are more green, more circular. However, what we need to be aware of is greenwashing, and this does happen a lot in banks. They talk about sustainable products, but when you look into them in more detail, they're not really fully sustainable and certainly not circular. And it's rare to find an explicitly circular product, but there are a few banks doing that. So private financing. If you can't get money from government or a grant to make the changes that you need to make, you need to look elsewhere. If you need a particular loan or finance product in order to do something in your organization, then you can go to retail banking or investment banking, corporate banking or insurance. And you can make choices in all of these places as to who you invest with, who you are invested by, and what products they offer. So why do banks invest? They're looking for a return on investment. They are using people's savings in order to grow those savings for those people who've given them the money. So they need to find, first and foremost, a financial return on investment. But increasingly, they're looking at social or environmental return on investment, which ultimately avoids financial costs in the future because you are mitigating actions by investing in certain products or innovation. So next, I think that is the one we need to go to. Right, that's the one I need to go to. So this is just an example of the Lloyds Bank Great Green Multiplier. I've had a quick read around what they're actually doing, and again, it's a sustainable and a green product, and how they're loaning to people and what they will fund. But I don't see anything that says circular. And the reason why it came up on my search is because they mentioned circular once in their whole website, and that's why it came up on my search. So that was interesting. They haven't quite integrated it, but they've got the knowledge about circular. And again, you know, people like big finance institutions and banks will come to the University of Exeter because they know that we have a masterclass and that we do look at sustainable leadership, and we can work with them to get the information to them so that they can then feed that into their products. I've put a few links on the side here, and Lloyds Bank has funded the Green Growth Index, so that's quite an interesting one to go and look at. And Opportunities for the Green Economy in the UK, they've also written that paper. Ellen MacArthur Foundation, who've presented to us today, have a good paper on financing the circular economy. That is quite old again, but they've recently updated some of their work on financing the circular economy and did a webinar on it a couple of weeks ago, which you'll find on their website. Some of the other things really I wanted to mention are if you can't fund your change yourself and you need to undertake research, you can always come into us and start working with us and exploring what programs we've already got running that you might be able to tag along on, or that we can do some in-depth work with you. For example, as part of the NICER program and the sector project, Danny has been doing work with some companies on looking at how they refurbish or how they do certain things. And so that is one way to get free support, which is funded by government, into your business. And there are a number of various little programs like that that are hosted by Exeter University. And I'm just going to flick over to my other screen, which is just to show you a few of those. So if I look at Exeter Innovation, that is your landing page if you ever want to know what we're doing in the field of innovation, and that'll give you a whole lot of different ideas about what the university is doing. You will get into somebody who can talk to you about what you want to do and maybe signpost you or not, you know, if we can't. Green Future Solutions is a great new project funded by government, and what they're doing is looking at various research and business projects and in order to work with them on solutions. So if you just look at what they're doing with business, they're looking at leadership. So I talked about a masterclass on sustainable leadership. We've also got a circular economy masterclass. They'll look at skills analysis, supply chain analysis, product design, closed loop system design, and all of those other things. So they're indirect routes that you can go through in order to fund what you want to do, or have some really experienced resource to come and look at what you do. And it helps our research, but it also helps you to improve. Lastly, just wanted to talk about Innovate UK. That is a government programme. This is the doorway into any government innovation and research funding in this country. And it's a useful one to look at if you really do want to be part of a project, if you're a slightly larger organisation and you've got something that you want to be innovative with. So they have rolling projects. As you can see, all the research institutes are represented here, and you can do various searches on their funding facility to see what's going on at the time. You need to do this often because these change monthly. They've got quite a short preparation time, so and it's a bit of an art to get bids through this particular way. But again, you know, if you are working with the university as a partner, we can sometimes work with you on those things. So really, that's all I had to say. And you know, I'd love to be able to give you lots of links and ideas about how you can actually get a grant for something, but it's about being creative. It's about thinking about what you want to do, and it's about thinking about why would anybody fund me for this? What's their incentive for funding me, and being able to sell your idea to them in that way. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. It's so valuable to have some understanding of what funders are looking for and how you can respond to that. I'm really conscious that it's 12 o'clock, so we've come to the scheduled end of our meeting, and if you've got somewhere else to go, thank you so much for coming. It's been great to have you here, and thank you for your engagement in our Q&A panel. So please do go if you've got to go. For those of you that can stay, I'm just going to spend 5 minutes talking about what's next for us, what might be next for you, and asking for a bit of feedback. So just in terms of our project, so the next steps for us are we're going to run 2 working group sessions, and I understand that many of you are already registered for those. Can you go back a slide, please, Alex? Thank you. And the dates are confirmed now for the 6th and the 14th of November. So thank you to all of you who responded to the poll that we sent out. You'll receive your invitation in the next couple of days. And we're going to focus the sessions, the first session very much on exploring what success looks like. What does a circular economy look like for hospitality? How can it bring about mutual benefits right across the supply chain, so not just for one particular area? And then the second session, we're going to build on some of that and work together to pull out some of the key priorities and the recommendations that we can put into our roadmap. So your engagement on those groups is absolutely crucial to the success of our report and our road mapping. We wouldn't be able to do it without you. So I look forward to welcoming you at those. Then, of course, in December, we'll be developing our roadmap, our recommendations, and writing up our report. We will hold an open event to share the findings with you all. And underneath all of that is the academic research and the data gathering that goes on in the background. If you haven't received an invitation and you'd like to come to the working groups, I have put my email at the bottom there. Please do get in touch and we'll send those to you. Next slide, please. So that was what's next for us. What's next for you? We've got lots of resources that you can tap into. There's been loads of resources on the throughout the workshop today. So you've heard about our masterclass. We've also got a website, the Circular Economy Knowledge Hub, where you can find recorded webinars, and there's lots more information on the circular economy, and there's lots of case studies. And if any of you have got a particular case study that you'd like to share with us, that we can share with the community, we'd love to have some more hospitality focused case studies on there. So again, do please get in touch. And there's the Circular Business Model Design Guide, which can take you through the steps of working out what circular economy does mean for your business. So have a look at those. Next slide, please. And finally, you've been absolutely fantastic. You've done loads of listening this morning. Could we ask you to pop onto menti.com and tell us what your immediate reaction is to the challenges of adopting a circular economy for hospitality? So as we've had been listening to the speakers, I'm sure lots of the things you thought are brilliant. I could do that. That's really inspiring. And then there'll be other things that you think, oh, well, I'm not sure about that. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to manage that. So this is your chance to tell us what your response is. So have a look on there. We're going to share the results in a moment. And we'll also feed back your responses into our working groups.
So I'll just come in here and say, for those of you who've never done this before, just get your phone out, put it on the camera, place it over the QR code on the screen, and you'll see a link to a website. Just press on that yellow link and then your voting opportunity will come up. We're looking for a word cloud here. We just need 3 words that describe what you believe the main challenges are for adopting the circular economy in the hospitality sector. So we just need your 3 words. And I'm just going to flick over to the Mentimeter. And here it is starting to arrive.
Fantastic. So for those of you who've not used Mentimeter before, the size of the text represents how many people have put that word in. So we've got a few saying clarity. We've got behaviour, responsibility, simplicity, availability of products, complicated. There's a few that are linked there. Lovely. And we do also have another survey for you to give a little bit more detail about your experience today, about anything else that you might like to hear more about. We're always looking for more inspiration for our lunch and learn sessions, so we can respond to some of your biggest challenges in detail there as well. So if you can take a couple of minutes to do that, we'll send you out the link and it'll be available in a minute. Got a few more responses coming in there. buyer reluctance and cost. Behaviour change is always a big one. It comes up across each of the sectors that we're looking at.
Clarity, knowledge and vision is quite interesting that lots of people have put that.
Consistency, couple on government and government support. There we go. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking part in that and giving us some early feedback that we can use for our working group sessions. As I said, there is another survey. If you can spend 3 minutes completing that, again, that will feed into our working groups and also give us an idea of what else you would like some guidance on. But on that note, thank you so much for coming. It's been great to see so many of you here and engaged in the topic of the circular economy. And we hope to see you again in future in our working groups. Thank you.